The Montana sky stretched gray and infinite above the cemetery, the kind of sky that made a man feel small against the weight of eternity. Ethan Carter stood apart from the other mourners, his dress uniform crisp despite the two-day drive from Colorado, his posture military straight, even as something inside him wanted to collapse. 58 years old, and he'd never learned how to bend without breaking. The casket sat above the open grave like an accusation. Polished oak, simple brass handles, no flowers except a single wreath from the veterans of foreign wars. William Carter had died the way he'd lived, alone and stubborn, asking nothing from anyone, receiving exactly what he'd asked for. 23 people had come to say goodbye. Ethan counted them twice, a habit from his Army Corps of Engineers days when precision mattered, when counting things kept your mind from wandering into darker territory. 23 souls in a town that had known William Carter for 67 years. That number told its own story. The pastor spoke words that floated past without landing. Good man, hard worker, devoted to his land, all the safe phrases people used when they didn't really know the deceased, or worse, when they knew him too well and chose kindness over truth. Ethan watched the pastor's mouth move and heard only the wind cutting across the open prairie, that endless Montana wind that never stopped reminding you how exposed you were, how far from shelter. His eyes found the other faces. Marcus Brennan stood at the front, 65 years old, and trying to hide the tremor in his hands that came from too much drinking or too much stress, or both. His older cousin, though they'd grown up more like brothers in the same house after Marcus's father died young. Marcus wore a suit that had cost money once, but now hung loose on a frame that had shrunk with disappointment. His wife stood beside him, looking anywhere but at her husband. Lorraine Hartford dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that matched her black dress, 62 and still beautiful in that weathered Montana way, like a barn that had survived too many winters to count. Her husband Harold had died 6 months ago, cancer, and the medical bills had taken everything except the tears. She caught Ethan looking and turned away quickly, guilt in the movement. The pastor finished. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The phrases men had been saying over graves for thousands of years, as if repetition could make death mean something other than the end of everything. People filed past the casket, touching it briefly, whispering their private goodbyes. Ethan stayed rooted, watching. He'd said his goodbye to William Carter 25 years ago in a different cemetery, standing over his mother's grave while his father stood on the opposite side, refusing to meet his eyes. That had been the last time they had occupied the same space. A quarter-century of silence, broken only now by this final silence that could never be unbroken. Marcus approached as the others drifted toward their cars, toward the reception at the church basement that Ethan had no intention of attending. His cousin's face carried decades of resentment like scar tissue, visible in every line. Surprised you showed. Marcus's voice carried the same rough edge it had developed somewhere in his 40s when life started teaching him lessons he didn't want to learn. Dad didn't want you here. Ethan kept his gaze on the casket. I'm here to bury him, not reconcile. Little late for either, don't you think? Marcus laughed, bitter and short. 25 years. Didn't even come when he got sick. Just waited for him to die so you could claim what's yours. The words should have stung, but Ethan had spent too many years in combat zones to be wounded by mere anger. He'd seen men die calling for mothers who'd abandoned them, fathers who'd beaten them, children who'd forgotten them. He'd learned that death didn't care about your unfinished business. Lorraine materialized beside them, her perfume something floral that reminded Ethan achingly of his dead wife, Sarah. She touched Marcus's arm gently, a gesture that said more about their shared history than words could. Marcus, please. Her voice soft, careful. Not here. Not today. Marcus shrugged off her hand but stepped back. You're right. Some things should stay buried. He walked away, and Lorraine lingered, her eyes searching Ethan's face for something she didn't find. He talked about you at the end, called your name. Ethan felt something twist in his chest but kept his voice level. What did he say? She hesitated, and in that hesitation Ethan saw the lie forming, the kind mercy she was about to offer. She thought better of it, credit to her. I don't know. He was mostly gone by then. Morphine. But your name was the last clear word we heard. Just Ethan, over and over, like a question he couldn't remember how to finish. The image hit harder than Ethan expected. His father, mind-clouded with drugs and dying cells, searching through the fog for a son who wasn't there and wouldn't come. He'd imagined William's death 100 different ways over the years, but never like that, never calling for him. "I should have come," Ethan heard himself say, the words escaping before he could stop them. Lorraine's expression softened into something like pity, which was worse than anger. "Yes, you should have." She left him alone then, the last mourner departing until only Ethan remained with the groundskeepers who waited at a respectful distance, leaning on their shovels, probably wondering if this gray-haired man in the dress uniform was going to stand there all day. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain and turned earth. Ethan stepped forward finally, placed his hand on the casket's sun-warmed surface. The wood felt solid, real, more real than anything else in this moment. "I don't know what to say to you," his voice barely audible, meant only for the dead man in the box and maybe for himself. "I don't know if I came here to forgive you or to make sure you were really gone." The casket offered no answers. Death was good at that, removing the possibility of resolution, leaving only the questions that would never be answered. A groundskeeper cleared his throat gently. "Sir, we need to—" Ethan nodded, stepped back. "Do what you need to do." He walked to his truck, a 15-year-old Ford F-150 that had seen better decades, much like its owner. Behind him came the sound of dirt hitting wood, that hollow thump that signaled the final separation between the living and the dead. He didn't look back. Some things you had to walk away from without checking to see if they'd follow. The drive to the motel took 20 minutes through town, past storefronts he remembered from childhood that now housed different businesses or stood empty, past the high school where he'd played football badly and dreamed of escape constantly, past the diner where his mother had worked weekends to help make ends meet. Everything looked smaller, shabbier, like the whole town had been shrinking in his absence, contracting around the loss of whatever had once made it matter. The motel room smelled like every motel room he'd ever stayed in during his years with the Corps, during his failed attempts at civilian contracting after retirement, during the long drives he'd taken after Sarah died because sitting still meant thinking and thinking meant drowning. Generic, clean, anonymous. He sat on the bed with his floral bedspread and stared at the envelope the lawyer had handed him after the service. "Private," the lawyer had said. "Instructions were to give this to you after burial, to be opened alone." The envelope was thick, cream-colored, expensive. William Carter had never spent money on expensive things, which made this gesture more significant. Ethan's name on the front in his father's angular handwriting. The letters precisely formed despite what must have been a dying man's trembling hand. He opened it carefully, the way you'd open something that might contain a bomb. The letter inside ran 3 pages, covered front and back in that same precise script. "Son." The word stopped Ethan cold. William had never called him son in speech, always just Ethan or boy when he was young, nothing at all when he was grown. Seeing it written now felt like hearing a ghost speak in a voice you'd forgotten it possessed. "If you're reading this, I'm gone." "Good. Means I don't have to say this to your face, which I probably couldn't do anyway. Never been good with words," your mother used to say. Never been good with feelings either, though she was too kind to say that part. Ethan could hear William's voice in the words, that flat Montana inflection that made everything sound like a statement of fact rather than opinion. "The ranch is yours. 1 year. The will says you have to live there 1 full year before you can sell or transfer ownership. I know you're thinking that's just one last way for me to control you from the grave, and maybe it is. But it's also the only way I could think to make you stay long enough to understand." The letter continued, and Ethan read faster, his pulse quickening. "Marcus will fight you. He thinks he's entitled because he stayed, because he's blood family, because he's the one who was here when I got sick. He's not wrong about staying. He was here. You weren't, but he's wrong about the rest, and you'll understand why when you find what I left in my desk. Bottom drawer, false bottom, same place I kept everything that mattered, which wasn't much. My journal's there. Read it. Then decide if I was the man you thought I was, or something else entirely." The handwriting grew shakier toward the end, as if William had been tiring. "Marcus thinks the land should go to him by bloodline. He'll say you don't deserve it, that you abandoned us, that you're not really family. In some ways he's right, but in the only way that matters, he's wrong. You'll see. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you these things when I could still look you in the eye. I'm sorry I was hard on you when you were young. I'm sorry I turned away at your mother's funeral when you needed me to be strong enough to bridge the gap between us. I'm sorry I taught you to be tough instead of teaching you to be tender. The army taught you to be hard. I taught you nothing except that men don't talk about what hurts. That's my failure, not yours. If you stay the year, you'll learn things about me, about your Uncle Thomas, about your mother, about yourself. Things I should have told you decades ago but couldn't find the courage for. Secrets are heavy, son, and I've carried them so long I forgot they were supposed to be shared. Forgive me if you can. Finish this if you can't. The letter was signed simply Dad, and seeing that word in William's handwriting broke something in Ethan that had held solid through the funeral, through Marcus's accusations, through Lorraine's pity. His father had never signed anything, Dad. Not birthday cards, not the few letters he'd sent during Ethan's deployments, not the awkward note that had accompanied the high school graduation gift. Always William, or W. Carter, or just initials. But here in this final message meant only for Ethan's eyes, William had claimed that title, Dad. As if in death, he could finally admit to the relationship he'd kept at arm's length in life. Ethan sat in the motel room as afternoon faded to evening, reading the letter 3 more times, finding new weight in each sentence. The television stayed dark. His phone stayed silent. Outside, Montana moved through its daily rhythms without him, and he was grateful for the anonymity, the temporary shelter of a room where no one knew him and nothing was expected. When darkness came fully, he drove. The ranch sat 14 miles outside town, accessible by a gravel road that had never been properly maintained, bordered by fence posts that leaned like old men tired of standing. Ethan's headlights cut through the darkness, catching the reflective eyes of deer in the distant tree line, illuminating the ranch sign that still read, Carter Land, Ested on 1922, despite decades of weather trying to erase the words. The house appeared gradually, a dark shape against darker sky. 2 stories, wrap-around porch, peaked roof that had lost more shingles than it retained. Ethan killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the ever-present wind. This was where he'd learned to walk, to ride, to fight, to leave. Every memory of his first 18 years contained this house somewhere in the frame, backdrop to joy and trauma in equal measure. Coming back felt like stepping into a photograph, except the colors had faded and everything was smaller than memory had preserved it. He found the key where William had written it would be, under a loose floorboard on the porch, wrapped in oilcloth against moisture. The door opened with a groan of hinges that hadn't moved in months, and Ethan stepped into the smell of closed rooms and old lives. His hand found the light switch from muscle memory, and a single bulb flickered to life, revealing the front room exactly as he remembered it. Same furniture, same photographs on the mantel, same sense that time had stopped here when he'd left and never resumed. Dust covered everything like a shroud. His footsteps left prints on the hardwood floor as he moved deeper into the house, drawn by gravity or memory or obligation toward his father's study. The door stood open. Inside, the room waited like a museum dedicated to a man who died without fanfare. The massive oak desk dominated the space, its surface scarred by years of use and abuse. Behind it, bookshelves lined the walls, packed with agricultural journals, legal documents, and family photographs that documented generations of Carters working this land. Ethan pulled the dust cover from William's chair and sat, the leather protesting his weight with sounds that might have been complaint or welcome. From this position, he could see what his father had seen every day. The window overlooking the eastern pasture, the filing cabinets full of ranch business, the photographs of people who'd come before, their faces stern with the seriousness of survival. One photograph caught his attention, William as a young man, maybe 20, standing beside another man who looked almost identical. Twins, though Ethan had never known his father had a twin. The other man wore a military uniform, Korea era based on the insignia, and had his arm around William's shoulders in a gesture of casual affection Ethan had never seen his father display. He filed the question away and turned to the desk drawers. The bottom drawer stuck, swollen with humidity. Ethan worked it carefully, feeling for the false bottom William had mentioned. His fingers found the edge, pried gently, and the panel lifted to reveal a space that held 3 items. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. A manila envelope sealed with tape. A small wooden box that rattled when he lifted it. Ethan opened the journal first. The entries began in 1989, the year after Ethan had left for basic training. William's handwriting filled page after page, neat and controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos the words described. Ethan gone to Army today. Watched his bus leave at dawn. Didn't wave, he didn't look back. Maybe it's better this way. He doesn't need to know what's coming. Doctor confirmed today, prostate cancer stage 2. Treatment options exist, but recovery uncertain. Won't tell anyone. Marcus would see it as weakness. Lorraine would fuss. Ethan would feel obligated to come home, and I won't do that to him. He's finally free. Ethan's hands trembled as he read. His father had been sick for 35 years, fighting cancer in secret while Ethan built a life elsewhere, oblivious. The entries continued, documenting treatments, remissions, recurrences. Between the medical updates, other concerns appeared. References to the Hartwell Mining Company, mentions of property surveys and mineral rights, cryptic notes about protecting something unnamed from people unspecified. Then, 10 years ago, an entry that changed everything. Blood work came back today. Routine physical. The doctor looked at my chart twice, then looked at me, then asked if I knew my blood type. Rh negative, I told him, same as always. He asked about my son. I said Ethan's O positive, been that way since birth. The doctor got quiet then, the kind of quiet that means he's trying to figure out how to tell you something you don't want to hear. He explained genetics. Rh negative, father cannot produce Rh positive offspring. Impossible. Which means either the hospital made a mistake in 1965 or Ethan isn't biologically mine. I told the doctor the hospital made no mistake. I've known since Ethan was 6 months old, and we did blood typing for a medical procedure. Known and never said a word. Not to Sarah, not to Ethan, not to anyone. Because he's my son. Not by blood maybe, but by everything else that matters. I raised him. I taught him. I watched him grow. Biology doesn't erase that. But Marcus will use this if he ever finds out. We'll say Ethan has no claim to Carterland, that blood matters, that inheritance follows DNA, not love. So this stays secret. Ethan never needs to know he's not mine by birth. He just needs to know I chose him anyway. Ethan set the journals down carefully, his vision blurring. The words rearranged his entire history, every memory suddenly suspect, every interaction requiring reinterpretation through this new lens. He wasn't William's biological son, which meant somewhere, somehow, his mother Sarah had conceived him with another man. An affair or something darker, or circumstances he couldn't begin to imagine. And William had known, had raised him anyway, had loved him in the only way William knew how to love, which was stern and distant and protective. The manila envelope contained what Ethan needed next. Medical records, blood tests, all confirming what the journal had revealed. And beneath those, a single photograph, old and faded. 3 people stood in front of this very house. A young Sarah Carter, radiant and pregnant. A young William, one arm around her shoulders. And beside them, the same man from the photograph on the shelf, the twin in the military uniform, his hand resting gently on Sarah's swollen belly. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, Thomas, William, and me. 6 months before Ethan arrives. Before Thomas deploys. Before everything changes. Thomas. The name meant nothing to Ethan, but clearly it had meant everything to his mother, to William, to the family history he'd never been told. The wooden box held one final revelation. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, a military medal. Bronze Star, awarded to Sergeant Thomas Carter, United States Army, Korean War, killed in action 1952. Except beneath the medal, a letter dated 1953, addressed to William Carter from the Department of Defense. We regret to inform you that your brother Thomas Carter, previously listed as killed in action, has been reclassified as missing in action, prisoner of war status unconfirmed. Recent intelligence suggests American POWs remain in North Korean custody. We will update you as information becomes available. Ethan read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new implications. Thomas Carter, his uncle, possibly his biological father based on the photograph and the blood type evidence. Missing in Korea, not killed. Prisoner of war, fate unknown. Which meant Ethan's entire understanding of his identity had just collapsed. He wasn't William's son. He was Thomas's son, raised by an uncle who'd never claimed that title, who'd let Ethan believe a lie for 58 years. And William had carried that secret like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year, crushing him slowly, but never released. A sound from outside broke Ethan's spiral. Car engine, tires on gravel, headlights sweeping across the window. He moved to look out, military instincts kicking in, assessing threats. Marcus's BMW sat in the driveway, engine still running, headlights illuminating the porch. The man himself sat behind the wheel, staring at the house, making no move to exit. They looked at each other across the distance, separated by glass and metal and history and blood that wasn't actually shared. Marcus's expression carried something Ethan couldn't quite read. Anger, yes, but also pain, and beneath that, a pleading quality that looked wrong on his cousin's face. Then Marcus put the car in reverse and backed away, turning around in the yard, leaving without ever cutting the engine or stepping outside. The taillights disappeared down the gravel road, and Ethan was alone again with secrets that kept getting heavier. He returned to the journal, reading faster now, searching for answers. The entries from the last year of William's life grew increasingly desperate. Cancer's back, stage 4 this time. Doctor says 6 months, maybe a year with treatment. I'm 73 years old. I've fought this disease for 35 years. I'm tired, but I can't die yet. Not until Ethan comes home. Not until he understands what we've protected here, what Thomas died for, what I've spent my life defending. The Hartwell Mining Company knows I'm dying. They're circling like vultures. Marcus has been talking to them. I know because their offers are getting more specific, more aggressive. They know things only family would know. Marcus thinks the ranch is worthless except for the land sale value. He doesn't know about the copper, doesn't know about the sacred burial grounds, doesn't know that Thomas made a promise to the Cheyenne people before he deployed, a promise I've kept for 60 years. If Marcus inherits, he'll sell to Hartwell within a week. They'll mine the copper, destroy the sacred sites, erase everything Thomas died trying to protect. So I changed my will. Everything goes to Ethan with conditions. He has to live here 1 year. Long enough to find this journal, long enough to understand, long enough to decide if he'll honor Thomas's promise or walk away. I'm betting he'll stay. He's more like Thomas than he knows. Stubborn about the wrong things, principled about the right ones. The final entries were dated just days before William's death. Pain's unbearable now. Morphine helps but makes thinking hard. Dr. Chen offered to help me end it on my terms. I refused. Not yet. Not until I finish this letter to Ethan. I called his number 3 times. Hung up before he answered each time. What would I say? Son, come home. I'm dying. Also, you're not really my son. You're my brother's boy. And by the way, I need you to protect a copper mine and some dead Indians from a mining company that's been trying to kill us for 70 years. Even for a deathbed confession, that's a lot. So I'll leave it in writing. Coward's way out, but at least he'll have the truth. Talked to Eleanor Brooks today. Told her everything. Asked her to help Ethan when the time comes. She'll know what to do. She always does. Should have married her after Sarah died, but I was too much of a fool. Story of my life. Too proud, too stubborn, too late. I'm sorry, Ethan, for all of it. For being cold when you needed warmth. For pushing you away when you needed pulling close. For letting you think you weren't wanted when the truth was, I wanted you too much and didn't know how to show it without revealing the secret. Thomas was the good brother. Brave, kind, open-hearted. I was the cautious one, the careful one, the one who survived by keeping everything locked down tight. When he died or didn't die, when he went missing, I promised him I'd take care of his family. You and Sarah. I kept that promise the only way I knew how. By being hard, by being distant, by protecting you from threats you didn't even know existed. But I forgot to tell you that I loved you. Forgot to say it out loud. Assumed you'd know because I kept you fed and clothed and safe. But safety isn't the same as love, and I robbed you of knowing the difference. If you're reading this, I'm dead, and you're probably angry, confused, feeling betrayed. You have every right. I kept secrets that weren't mine to keep. I let you live a lie because the truth seemed too complicated. But now you know. You're Thomas Carter's son. You're my nephew by blood, my son by choice. And this land, this ranch, this impossible burden I'm leaving you, it's not really about inheritance or money or family legacy. It's about keeping a promise. A promise Thomas made to a Cheyenne elder in 1951 before he deployed. A promise to protect sacred ground. A promise I've kept for 60 years in his absence. Now it's your turn. Stay the year. Learn the whole story. Then decide. Forgive me if you can. Finish this if you can't. Dad. Ethan closed the journal and sat in the darkness of his father's study, in the chair where William had written these words, staring at the same walls, breathing the same air. 58 years old, widowed 3 years, estranged from his father for 25, and now learning that everything he believed about his identity was fiction. Not William's son, Thomas's son, A dead man's legacy passed to a nephew who'd spent half a century resenting the wrong father. Outside, the Montana night pressed against the windows, infinite and indifferent. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The sounds of predators marking territory, claiming what was theirs, warning away rivals. Ethan understood the impulse. He'd spent his life running from this place. From William, from the weight of Carter history. Now he was back, not as a son returning home, but as a stranger inheriting someone else's war. And Marcus knew. The journal had mentioned it. Marcus knew Ethan wasn't William's biological son, which meant Marcus would fight the inheritance, would use the truth as a weapon, would claim that blood trumped choice, that DNA mattered more than decades of reluctant fatherhood. The battle was already starting, had started before William died, before Ethan arrived, before any of them were born. 70 years of conflict over this land, over copper buried in sacred ground, over promises made by dead men to dying cultures. Ethan should leave, should sign over the ranch to Marcus and walk away, return to Colorado, to his empty house and his empty life and his memories of Sarah. He owed William nothing. He owed Thomas even less. A biological father he'd never met who'd abandoned his pregnant girlfriend to go fight a war and die, or not die in a foreign land. But Sarah's voice came to him then, as it often did in moments of decision. His wife, dead 3 years from the same cancer that had killed William. Her final words to him, a whisper in a hospice room that smelled like disinfectant and defeat. Don't waste what's left, Ethan. Don't run from the hard things just because they are hard. You've been running your whole life. It's time to stand still long enough to see what you've been running from. He'd promised her he'd try. In the end, when promises were all they had left, he'd given his word. Standing now, joints protesting with the stiffness of late middle age, Ethan moved through the dark house, climbing stairs. He'd climbed 10,000 times as a boy, finding his old bedroom by memory and moonlight. The room remained unchanged. Same bed, same desk, same posters on the walls from bands he'd loved at 16. Same window that looked out over the eastern pasture where he'd learned to ride, learned to rope, learned to hate the endless sameness of ranch life. Except now, with decades in distance, the sameness looked different, looked like consistency, looked like something that lasted when everything else fell apart. Ethan lay on the bed without undressing, staring at the ceiling he'd stared at as a teenager, planning his escape, counting the days until he could leave and never return. That boy seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime, someone who'd thought running away solved anything. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of dreams, Sarah calling his name, William standing silent in doorways, and a man Ethan had never met, Thomas Carter, wearing a military uniform and holding a photograph of a pregnant woman, saying words Ethan couldn't hear but desperately needed to understand. He woke at dawn to the sound of someone knocking on the front door, insistent and unapologetic. The bedside clock read 6:15, too early for social calls, which meant this was business. Ethan descended the stairs, each step a negotiation with a body that reminded him daily it had lived 58 years, most of them hard. Through the window beside the door, he could see an older woman on the porch, gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt like armor against the morning chill. He opened the door. The woman smiled, sad and knowing. You look like him. Like Thomas, I mean. William always said so, but I never saw it until now. Ethan's brain, still foggy with sleep and confusion, took a moment to place her. Eleanor Brooks, librarian, William's friend, the woman mentioned in the journal. Mrs. Brooks, Eleanor, please. She held up a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Brought you breakfast and information your father asked me to deliver. May I come in? Ethan stepped aside and Eleanor Brooks entered with the confidence of someone who'd been here before, many times in better circumstances. She moved to the kitchen, set the basket on the table, began unpacking food like this was routine. Your father called me 3 days before he died. Eleanor's voice, matter of fact, no pretense of small talk, said if anything happened, I should give you this. She produced a box from her large purse, old and battered, secured with twine. Ethan took it carefully, feeling the weight of more secrets, more revelations, more pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. What's in it? The truth, mostly. Eleanor met his eyes, and Ethan saw decades of knowledge there, of keeping William's confidence, of carrying burdens that weren't hers, about Thomas, about your mother, about why William was the way he was. She poured coffee from a thermos, handed him a cup. "You should sit down for this." Ethan sat. Eleanor opened the box, revealing photographs, letters, documents that looked official and ominous. She selected one photograph, passed it across the table. Two young men, identical, arms around each other, laughing at something off camera. The kind of photograph that captured a moment of pure, unself-conscious joy. William and Thomas Carter. Eleanor's voice soft now, remembering. Twins. Inseparable until Korea. Thomas was the bright one, the charming one, the one everyone loved. William was the careful one, the responsible one, the one who stayed home and ran the ranch while Thomas went off to save the world. She laid out more photographs. Thomas in uniform. Thomas with Sarah, looking at her like she contained every answer he'd ever need. Thomas standing in front of this ranch house, hand on Sarah's pregnant belly. Your mother loved Thomas first. They were engaged, planning a wedding for when he returned from deployment. Ethan's coffee went cold in his hands as Eleanor continued, building the history he'd never been told. Thomas shipped out in 1951. Sarah was already pregnant with you. He promised he'd come back, promised they'd marry, promised they'd raise you together on this ranch. Then the telegram came. Killed in action, it said. Body unrecovered. Sarah was devastated, 6 months pregnant, alone, grieving. William stepped up, married her, gave her his name, gave you his name, raised you as his own without question or complaint. Eleanor's eyes held Ethan's, making sure he understood. He loved her, had always loved her, even when she was Thomas's girl. But he never would have acted on it if Thomas had lived. Ethan found his voice, rough with emotion. Did my mother know that I wasn't William's? Eleanor nodded, of course, but they never spoke of it. William never threw it in her face during arguments. Sarah never used it as a weapon. They just lived with it, this shared secret that bound them together even as it kept them apart. And Thomas? Ethan needed to know. Did he really die? Eleanor's expression shifted, became cautious. That's complicated. She pulled out a military document, official letterhead, dated 1953. This came 2 years after the first telegram, reclassifying Thomas from killed in action to missing in action, prisoner of war status unconfirmed. William spent years trying to find out what happened, wrote to the Department of Defense, to veterans groups, to anyone who might have information. Got nowhere. Eventually, he had to accept that Thomas was gone one way or another, and your mother needed him to be present, not chasing ghosts. So he stayed. Eleanor's voice firm now, defensive of William's choices. He stayed and raised another man's child and never complained, never looked for credit, never expected gratitude. Just did what he thought was right, even though it cost him everything. What did it cost him? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. You, Eleanor, simple, direct. It cost him you. He could never fully love you the way you needed because doing so felt like betraying Thomas. And he could never tell you the truth because the truth felt like betraying Sarah. So he settled for being distant, being hard, being the kind of father who kept you safe but never close. The kitchen fell silent except for the old house settling, wood contracting with the morning cool, sounds of a structure that had sheltered generations of Carters through joy and sorrow and everything between. Why are you telling me this now? Ethan finally asked. Because William asked me to. Because you need to understand what you've inherited isn't just land and debt and a year of isolation. Eleanor leaned forward, urgent. You've inherited a promise, a sacred trust, and there are people who will do anything to break it. What promise? Eleanor pulled out the final document, and Ethan's world shifted again. A survey map, hand-drawn, dated 1951, marking the ranch boundaries, the copper deposits beneath, and in the eastern section, a notation in Thomas's handwriting, Cheyenne Burial Ground, protected, promise made. Before Thomas deployed, he discovered the copper. Eleanor traced the map with her finger. Also discovered that the deposit ran directly under sacred Cheyenne burial caves. The tribe had lost this land decades earlier through government seizure, but the sacred sites remained sacred. Thomas made a promise to a Cheyenne elder named Joseph Redfeather, promised that if he survived the war, he'd protect the burial grounds from mining companies who'd destroy them for profit. When Thomas didn't come back, William kept the promise. Spent 60 years fighting off Hartwell mining, protecting land that wasn't legally his to protect, honoring his dead brother's word to a dying culture. Ethan stared at the map, understanding dawning. The copper's valuable. Worth millions. Eleanor confirmed. Maybe tens of millions. Hartwell Mining has known about it for 70 years. They've been trying to acquire this property since your grandfather owned it. They've used bribes, threats, intimidation, possibly violence. Violence? Ethan looked up sharply. Eleanor's expression went grim. Your grandfather died in a convenient accident. Your father's truck accident was just a little too convenient. The brake line cut clean, according to the mechanic who checked before the insurance company made him change his report. You're saying Hartwell killed them. I'm saying your family has been at war for 3 generations, and you just inherited command. Eleanor stood, began gathering the photographs and documents, placing them carefully back in the box. William's will requires you to stay here 1 year. That year will be the hardest of your life. Marcus will fight you. Hartwell will try to break you. And you'll have to decide if you're willing to die for a promise made by a man you never met to protect people who lost this land long before you were born. She handed him the box. Your father left you more than a ranch, Ethan. He left you a choice. Honor the promise and lose everything. Or walk away and live with knowing you broke a chain that held for 70 years. Eleanor moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. The current Joseph Redfeather is the grandson of the man Thomas made the promise to. He's been watching this property, waiting to see what you'll do. You should talk to him. Where do I find him? Eleanor smiled slightly. You don't. He'll find you when he's ready. She left Ethan alone in the kitchen with coffee, breakfast he couldn't eat, and a box full of truths that rewrote everything he thought he knew about family, duty, and the weight of promises that outlived the men who made them. Outside, the Montana sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, revealing the ranch in full daylight. 300 acres of pasture, forest, and secret burial grounds. Copper worth millions buried beneath sacred earth. And somewhere in the balance, a choice Ethan had to make. He was 58 years old, a widower with no children, no close family except cousins who wanted him gone. No ties strong enough to hold him here except the fraying thread of a dead uncle's promise and a distant father's final request. Stay the year, learn the truth, honor the dead or dishonor them, but make the choice fully informed. Ethan picked up one of the photographs. Thomas Carter, young and alive and full of hope, standing where Ethan stood now, making promises he'd die trying to keep. For the first time in 25 years, Ethan felt something like connection to this place, to this history, to the long line of stubborn men who'd protected this land from people who saw only profit where others saw sacred. He had a year, 365 days to decide if he was a Carter by choice or just by accident of birth. The choice should have been easy. Walk away, take the money, let Marcus and Hartwell fight over bones and copper and ghosts. But Sarah's voice came again, that final whisper, don't run from the hard things. And beneath it, quieter, a voice Ethan had never heard but somehow recognized. Thomas's voice, the father he'd never known, saying words that felt true even without proof. Keep the promise. Some things matter more than survival. Ethan Carter set down his cold coffee, picked up the box of family secrets, and carried it to William's study. He had reading to do, a year to serve, a promise to understand. And somewhere in the next 12 months, he'd learn if he was the kind of man who kept faith with the dead, or the kind who broke promises to make life easier. The Montana wind picked up outside, rattling windows, testing foundations, reminding him that nothing stood forever, but some things stood long enough to matter. He opened the journal again and began to read. The county library smelled like old paper and forgotten promises, a scent that reminded Ethan of his mother's hands when she'd read to him as a child. Sarah Carter had loved books the way some people loved oxygen, necessary and sustaining, and she'd passed weekend afternoons in this very building while Ethan fidgeted in the children's section, too young to understand why anyone would choose words on pages over the open sky. Now, 35 years later, he understood. Words outlasted everything. Buildings crumbled, bodies failed, but words, properly preserved, kept speaking long after their authors turned to dust. Eleanor Brooks moved through the stacks with the efficiency of 40 years' experience, pulling files from metal cabinets that predated computers, spreading documents across a reading table like a general planning a campaign. Morning light slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny ghosts. These are the public records. Eleanor's voice library quiet despite the empty room. Property transfers, mining claims, Newspaper archives. The official history of Hartwell Mining's attempts to acquire your family's land. She laid out the first document, a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1951. The headline read, "Local Rancher Claims Major Copper Discovery." Beneath it, a photograph of a younger Henry Carter, Ethan's grandfather, standing beside what appeared to be a mine entrance, holding a chunk of green-veined rock. "Your grandfather found it first." Eleanor tapped the photograph. Spring of 1951, he was repairing fence line on the eastern boundary when he noticed exposed rock with copper coloring. Being a practical man, he had it assayed. The results came back extraordinary. 94% pure copper ore, one of the richest deposits ever found in Montana. Ethan studied his grandfather's face in the photograph. Henry Carter looked proud but wary, like a man who'd discovered treasure and immediately regretted telling anyone. Eleanor continued, pulling more clippings. Within a week, Hartwell Mining made an offer. 10 times the land's agricultural value. Henry refused. He'd already learned about the Cheyenne burial caves, you see. Your Uncle Thomas had shown him. She produced another photograph, this one more recent, but still decades old. Thomas Carter in civilian clothes, standing with an elderly Native American man beside the same mine entrance. Both men looked serious, ceremonial. "This is Joseph Redfeather, the elder." Eleanor's finger rested on the Native American man's image. Northern Cheyenne tribal elder. He approached Thomas in 1951 after hearing about the copper discovery, told him the deposit ran directly beneath sacred burial grounds, places where Cheyenne ancestors had been laid to rest before the government seized the land. Thomas made a promise that day. Eleanor's voice carried the weight of witnessed history. He promised that as long as a Carter owned this land, the sacred sites would be protected. No mining, no desecration, no profit over principle. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. A promise made 73 years ago by a man he'd never met, binding him across decades to an obligation he hadn't chosen. What happened next? Eleanor's expression darkened. She laid out a sequence of newspaper articles like cards in a deadly game. Mysterious fire destroys Carter Barn. Cattle disease strikes Carter Ranch. Carter Ranch hand hospitalized after beating. The headlines marched through 1952 and into 1953, each documenting another misfortune befalling the Carter family. Hartwell Mining didn't accept refusal gracefully. Eleanor's voice carried an edge now. They wanted that copper badly enough to make Henry's life hell. Fires, poisoned livestock, violence against workers. All of it untraceable, unprovable, but everyone in town knew who was behind it. And Henry? He fought back the only way he could. Legal channels. Eleanor pulled out court documents, filed complaints, demanded investigations, hired lawyers he couldn't afford. And when that failed, he did something brilliant. She produced a document that looked official and federal, stamped with Department of the Interior seals. In 1953, Henry Carter contacted a federal geological survey team, invited them to assess the deposit. The team confirmed the copper's value and, more importantly, confirmed the presence of archaeologically significant Native American burial sites. Eleanor's finger traced the document's key passage. The survey team recommended the entire area be designated as a federal strategic mineral reserve under the Defense Production Act of 1950. The designation would prevent commercial mining while preserving the copper for potential national security needs. Ethan leaned forward. They approved it? They did. June 15, 1953. But here's where it gets interesting. Eleanor pulled out more documents, letters between government officials. Senator Wade Hartwell, founder of Hartwell Mining, was serving in Congress at the time. He had significant influence over the Department of Interior. Within months of the designation, the paperwork was buried, classified, effectively hidden from public record. The designation remained legally valid but practically invisible. Eleanor's eyes met Ethan's. The mining company couldn't develop the land, but they could keep trying to acquire it, hoping to find some loophole or hoping the designation would be forgotten or reversed. 70 years, Ethan said quietly. They've been waiting 70 years. 3 generations of Hartwell executives. 3 generations of Carter men standing in their way. Eleanor began gathering the documents. Your grandfather died in a tractor accident in 1973. The brake line had been cut, according to a mechanic who checked it, but the official report said mechanical failure. Like Williams' truck, Eleanor confirmed. Your father knew. He found the mechanic's original report among Henry's papers. That's when he understood this wasn't just about money. This was about people willing to kill for copper buried under sacred ground. The library's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the only sound in the sudden silence. Ethan thought about his father, living with that knowledge for 50 years, raising a son he couldn't be close to because closeness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. Is there more? Ethan asked. Always. Eleanor smiled sadly. But you should hear the next part from someone else. Who? Eleanor checked her watch. He should be here any minute. I called him this morning. As if summoned by her words, the library's front door opened. A man entered, perhaps 68 or 70, with silver hair pulled back in a traditional braid, wearing jeans and a denim jacket over a shirt that might have cost $10 or $300. Impossible to tell. His face carried the weathered dignity of a life lived outdoors, and his eyes held the kind of knowledge that came from watching the same land for decades. Joseph Redfeather. Eleanor stood in greeting. Thank you for coming. The man nodded to her, then turned his full attention to Ethan. His gaze felt like an assessment, measuring something deeper than appearance. You're Thomas Carter's son. Not a question, a statement of fact. Ethan stood, offered his hand. Ethan Carter, though I'm learning that name might mean something different than I thought. Joseph's handshake was firm but brief. Names are just words we use to organize relationships. Blood is blood, regardless of what we call it. He moved to the table, glanced at the documents Eleanor had spread out, then looked back at Ethan. Your Uncle Thomas was the first white man I ever trusted. Did Eleanor tell you why? She mentioned a promise. Joseph settled into a chair with the ease of someone comfortable in his own skin. Spring of 1951, I was 30 years old, newly appointed to the tribal council. We'd heard rumors about copper found on what used to be our land. Land the government took from us in the 1920s, promised us compensation we never received, said it was for the greater good of developing Montana. His voice carried no bitterness, just the flat recitation of historical fact. When we learned about the discovery, we knew what would come. Mining companies, destruction, our ancestors' bones treated like obstacles to profit. Thomas Carter came to me, not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand what he'd found. Joseph's expression softened slightly. He was maybe 23 years old, about to deploy to Korea, newly engaged to your mother. He could have ignored us, sold to the mining company, set up his family for life. But he didn't. He sat where you're sitting now and listened while I told him about the burial caves, how they'd been sacred for 200 years before white settlers came, how even after we lost the land, we tried to maintain the sites until access was forbidden, how our people believed disturbing those graves would bring consequences that transcended law or money. Joseph leaned back, remembering. Thomas said something I've never forgotten. He said, "My child will be born while I'm overseas. If I don't come back, I want that child to inherit land that honors the dead instead of profiting from them. Will you teach me how to protect these places?" Ethan felt his throat tighten. And you did. We made a pact. Joseph's voice firm now. He would refuse all offers from mining companies. He would protect the burial sites. And in return, we would honor the Carter family as friends of the Northern Cheyenne people. As long as a Carter held that land and kept that promise, we would support them however we could. Then Thomas deployed. Joseph's face showed the weight of old grief. We received word he was killed in action. Your mother was 6 months pregnant. The promise seemed to die with him. But William Carter came into me in 1953. Joseph's voice held something like respect. Told me his brother had explained everything before deploying. Said he would honor Thomas's promise, even though the land was now legally his. Said his nephew, meaning you, would be raised to understand the obligation. Ethan processed this. William had planned for this moment, prepared for it across 50 years, knowing someday Ethan would be sitting in this library, learning about promises that bound generations. My grandfather died protecting it. My father died protecting it, Ethan's voice rough. And now I'm supposed to do the same. Joseph studied him carefully. You're supposed to choose. That's all any of us can do. Choose whether to honor what came before or choose to start fresh. There's no wrong answer, only consequences. What are the consequences if I walk away? The burial caves will be destroyed within a year. Joseph's answer immediate. Hartwell Mining has been waiting for this moment. They know you're not from here, have no connection to this place. No reason to fight a battle that isn't yours. They're counting on you to sell. And if I stay? Joseph's smile held no humor. Then you'll learn what your grandfather and father learned, that protecting sacred ground from people who see only profit is a war you can't win, only delay. You'll face harassment, legal challenges, probably violence. You might die like they did. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, traffic passed on the small town street, people going about ordinary lives, unaware of the conversation happening in this small library about choices that echoed across generations. Why are you telling me this, Ethan asked. If you know I'll probably fail, why not just let it go? Because maybe you won't fail. Joseph stood, preparing to leave. Your Uncle Thomas believed some things mattered more than success or failure. He believed bearing witness mattered, trying mattered, standing in the gap between what is and what should be, even knowing you'll be crushed there, that mattered most of all. He moved toward the door, then paused. My grandson carries my name, Joseph Redfeather III. He's been watching your property since your father died, making sure no one trespasses, no one starts preliminary surveys. When you're ready to see the burial caves, let Eleanor know. He'll meet you there. After Joseph left, Eleanor and Ethan sat in silence for a long moment. The weight of 70 years pressed down, making the air feel thicker, harder to breathe. There's more you need to see, Eleanor finally said, but it's not in the public records. She led him to a storage room in the library's basement, unlocked a cabinet marked personal collections, and withdrew a banker's box labeled Carter Family Materials, donated 2024. Your father brought this to me 3 months before he died. Eleanor set the box on a table, said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you after you'd learned the basics. I think you're ready now. Inside the box, Ethan found what looked like a private investigator's voice file. Photographs, photocopied documents, handwritten notes in William's precise script. All of it focused on one subject, Thomas Carter's fate in Korea. Eleanor watched as Ethan sorted through the materials. Your father never stopped looking for answers about his brother. He spent 50 years investigating, following every lead, contacting every veteran who might have known Thomas, filing Freedom of Information requests with the Department of Defense. The documents painted a picture that grew clearer and more disturbing with each piece of evidence. Thomas Carter's unit had been captured in November 1951 during a Chinese offensive. Initial reports listed him as killed in action, body unrecovered. Then in 1953, the status changed to missing in action, prisoner of war. Here, Eleanor handed Ethan a letter dated 1954, Department of Defense letterhead. This is where it gets complicated. The letter, addressed to William Carter, detailed intelligence suggesting American POWs remained in North Korean camps despite official denials. Thomas Carter's name appeared on a list of possible survivors, but the information was classified, unverified, politically sensitive. William had underlined a single sentence. Due to ongoing armistice negotiations, we cannot confirm or deny the survival status of personnel listed as MIA-PO. He never stopped believing Thomas was alive. Eleanor's voice soft. Every few years, new information would surface, a defector's testimony, a released prisoner's memories. Each time, William would investigate, hoping for proof. Did he find any? Eleanor reached into the box, pulled out a manila envelope marked 2023. This came a year before your father died. He showed it to me, swore me to secrecy, then sealed it in this box. Inside, Ethan found photocopies of what appeared to be North Korean government documents, translated into English. They detailed a prisoner camp that had operated from 1951 to 1995, housing American POWs who were never repatriated for political reasons. Among the names, Sergeant Thomas Carter, service number matching his military ID. According to these documents, Eleanor continued, Thomas survived in that camp for over 40 years. The records indicate he had contact with a Korean woman before his capture in 1951. They had a daughter together, born in early 1951, just months before Thomas was taken prisoner. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he held the documents. A daughter. I have a cousin. Eleanor's expression grew complicated. That's where this gets difficult. The documents indicate the infant daughter remained in Korea after Thomas's capture. Her mother, the Korean woman, died in 1953 during the war. The child was placed in an orphanage. She pulled out another document, This one an adoption certificate. The adoption was finalized in 1962 when the girl was 11 years old. The adoptive father's name made Ethan's blood run cold. Douglas Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Mining Corporation. They adopted Thomas's daughter. Ethan's voice barely above a whisper. The mining company adopted my cousin. Eleanor nodded. Her birth name was Carter Sue Jin. Her adopted name became Victoria Hartwell. She's currently the CEO of Hartwell Mining International, 73 years old. She's been trying to acquire your family's land for the past 15 years, never knowing she's trying to claim her biological father's legacy. The library basement felt too small suddenly, the air too thin. Ethan stood, paced the narrow space between shelves, trying to process the implications. Does she know? Eleanor shook her head. According to William's notes, she has no idea. The adoption records were sealed. The Hartwells never told her about her birth family. As far as Victoria knows, she's fighting to acquire valuable land for the company her adoptive father built. She doesn't know she's fighting against her own family's sacred promise. Ethan stopped pacing. We have to tell her. Do we? Eleanor's question sharp. Victoria Hartwell has spent her entire career building Hartwell Mining into what it is today. She's authorized bribes, intimidation, possibly violence to achieve the company's goals. Learning the truth might destroy her, or it might make her more dangerous. She deserves to know who she is. Perhaps. Eleanor began repacking the box. But consider the timing. Your father knew this for a year before he died. He chose not to reach out to her. Why do you think that was? Ethan didn't have an answer. The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp, but impossible to ignore. Take the box. Eleanor handed it to him. Study everything in it, then decide what to do. But be careful, Ethan. Victoria Hartwell is not just your cousin. She's the head of a company that's been trying to destroy your family for 3 generations. That doesn't change just because you share blood. The drive back to the ranch took Ethan through town, past its storefronts that had changed hands or closed entirely since his childhood, past the diner where his mother had worked, past the high school where he'd counted days until escape. Everything looked smaller in daylight, less mythic, just a small Montana town struggling to survive in an economy that had left rural America behind. Marcus's BMW sat in the ranch driveway when Ethan arrived. His cousin leaned against the hood, smoking a cigarette despite the no-smoking pledge he'd made to his wife years ago. The gesture spoke of desperation or defiance or both. We need to talk. Marcus's voice flat, exhausted. Ethan killed the engine, climbed out with the box of documents. About what? About the fact that you're not William's son. Marcus took a long drag, exhaled smoke toward the gray sky. About the fact that you have no legal claim to this land. About the fact that I've spent 65 years being second choice in a family where I should have been first. Ethan set the box down carefully. William's will was clear. Wills can be contested. Marcus flicked ash, especially when the beneficiary obtained the inheritance under false pretenses. I didn't know about the blood issue until I read his journal, but now you do. Marcus's eyes red-rimmed, possibly from smoke, possibly from tears. Now you know you're Thomas's bastard, raised by an uncle who felt obligated, and you're still going to take what should be mine by actual bloodline. Ethan studied his cousin, seeing past the anger to the pain beneath. You think being William's nephew gives you more claim than being his chosen son? I think blood matters. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. I think the land should go to family who stayed, who cared, who didn't run away and stay gone for 25 years. You were here. Ethan kept his tone even. What did you do at that time besides wait for him to die so you could cash out? Marcus flinched like he'd been struck. That's not fair, isn't it? Ethan picked up the box again. I know about Hartwell Mining, Marcus. I know you've been in contact with them. How much did they offer you to help push me out? The silence that followed confirmed everything. Marcus dropped the cigarette, ground it under his heel, wouldn't meet Ethan's eyes. They approached me 6 months ago. Marcus's voice quiet now, defeated. Said they knew William was dying. Said they'd pay me $500,000 if I could convince you to sell after the inheritance. Another $200,000 when the deal closed. Ethan felt disappointment rather than anger. You agreed. I'm 65 years old. Marcus looked up finally, and the desperation in his face was raw and real. I've got nothing. My business failed. My retirement's gone. I'm living on Social Security and my wife's salary and trying not to think about what happens when we can't work anymore. So you sold out your family. I sold out a cousin who wasn't even really family. Marcus's anger flaring again. You're Thomas's kid, not William's. You don't belong here. This land should be mine, and Hartwell's money could save my life. Ethan felt something shift in his understanding. Marcus wasn't evil, just desperate. A man at the end of his rope making terrible choices because he couldn't see better options. What did they tell you to do? Convince you to sell. Marcus shrugged. Make you uncomfortable. Remind you that you don't belong here. They said they'd handle the rest if persuasion didn't work. What's the rest? Marcus's expression went dark. I don't know. They didn't give details, but they mentioned that your father's accident was convenient and implied they could arrange similar convenience if necessary. They threatened to kill me, not directly, but yes, Marcus looked sick. That's when I realized this was more than just business for them. They're obsessed with this land, 70 years obsessed, the kind of obsession that doesn't respect boundaries or laws. Ethan set the box down again. Did you know about the burial caves, about the federal designation, about the promise Thomas made? Marcus shook his head. William never told me any of that. Just said the land was protected, couldn't be sold for mining. I thought he was being stubborn, holding on to the past. I didn't know about the sacred sites or the Cheyenne connection. And Victoria Hartwell? What about her? Did you know she's Thomas's daughter? That she's been fighting to claim her own father's land without knowing it? Marcus went pale. That's impossible. Ethan opened the box, showed him the adoption documents, the North Korean records, the evidence William had compiled. Marcus read in silence, his hands shaking slightly. Jesus, he finally said. She's our cousin. We've been working with our own cousin to steal from ourselves. The absurdity of it might have been funny in different circumstances. 3 cousins, none knowing their connection, fighting over land that bound them together even as it drove them apart. What do we do? Marcus asked. And for the first time since childhood, he sounded like he was genuinely asking Ethan's opinion rather than challenging it. Ethan didn't have an answer yet. The pieces were still forming, the picture still unclear. But one thing was becoming obvious. This wasn't a simple inheritance dispute. This was 3 generations of tragedy, secrets, and broken promises all coming to a head. You need to cut contact with Hartwell. Ethan's voice firm. Whatever they're paying you, it's not worth what they'll take. Marcus nodded slowly. And then what? Then we figure out what William wanted, what Thomas promised, what we owe to the dead, and what we owe to ourselves. Marcus looked at the ranch house, the land stretching beyond it, the weight of history pressing down on both of them. I hated him, you know. William. Hated how he looked at you like you mattered and looked at me like I was just there. But I never wanted him dead. I know, and I don't want you dead either. Marcus met his eyes. But I don't know how to stop what's already started. Hartwell doesn't give up. Once they target something, they don't stop until they get it or destroy it. Then we'll have to be harder to destroy than they expect. Marcus almost smiled. You sound like William. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. After Marcus left, Ethan spent the afternoon in William's study, reading through every document in the box, building a timeline of Thomas Carter's life and death and possible survival. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and enraging. Thomas Carter had survived the Korean War only to spend 40 years in a North Korean prison camp, forgotten by a government that found acknowledging his existence politically inconvenient. He'd had a daughter before his capture, a daughter he'd never met, a daughter who grew up in the care of the very company that had terrorized his family. And William had known, had carried that knowledge for a year before dying, had chosen not to act on it, had left it for Ethan to discover and decide what to do with. Why? Ethan asked the empty study. Why leave this to me? The answer came not from William but from Eleanor, who called his cell phone as evening darkened into night. I forgot to mention something, her voice apologetic. Your father left instructions for me to tell you only after you'd spoken with Marcus. What instructions? He said to tell you that Victoria Hartwell is not the enemy. She's a victim, same as you, same as Thomas. The real enemy is the system that turns families against each other for profit. Ethan absorbed this. He wanted me to save her. He wanted you to give her a choice. Eleanor's voice gentle. The same choice he gave you. To honor the past or break free from it, but with full knowledge of what she's choosing. Outside, something moved in the darkness. Ethan went to the window, saw headlights on the gravel road approaching slowly. Not Marcus's BMW, not Eleanor's sensible sedan. A black SUV with tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that meant business. The SUV stopped at the property line, but didn't advance onto Carter land. The driver's window rolled down, and even in the darkness, Ethan could make out a figure inside, watching the house. They sat like that for 5 minutes, predator and prey sizing each other up. Then the window rolled up, and the SUV backed away, disappearing into the night. Ethan's phone rang again. Unknown number, he answered. The voice on the other end was female, professional, measured. "Mr. Carter, this is Victoria Hartwell. I think it's time we met." Every instinct told Ethan to refuse, to hang up, to maintain distance from a woman who represented everything his family had fought against for 70 years. But he thought about Thomas, imprisoned for 40 years in a foreign land. Thought about William carrying secrets that had slowly crushed him. Thought about the weight of promises that outlived the men who made them. "Tomorrow," Ethan heard himself say. "The ranch, noon. I'll be there." The line went dead, and Ethan stood in his father's study, surrounded by ghosts and secrets, and the crushing responsibility of choices that would echo across generations yet unborn. Outside, the Montana night stretched infinite and cold, stars bright in the unpolluted darkness. The same stars Thomas had looked at from a prison camp, the same stars William had studied while making impossible decisions, the same stars that would shine long after all of them turned to dust. Some promises outlasted lifetimes. Some truths were too heavy to carry alone. And some families were bound by blood they didn't know they shared. Ethan had less than a year to figure out which mattered most. Victoria Hartwell arrived exactly at noon in a black Tesla that whispered to a stop on the gravel, like a predator stalking prey. Ethan watched from the porch, coffee growing cold in his hands, as she emerged from the vehicle with the kind of precision that spoke of a life lived in boardrooms and hostile negotiations. She was 73, but carried herself like someone who'd never learned to slow down, dressed in business casual that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Her silver hair cut in a style that said executive without trying too hard. She paused before approaching, taking in the ranch with eyes that assessed value the way a surgeon assessed a patient, clinical and detached. Ethan wondered what she saw. Dilapidated buildings and overgrown pastures, probably. 300 acres of underperforming agricultural land that could be converted to profit with the right application of capital and indifference to history. She couldn't see what he was beginning to see, the weight of promises, the graves of men who died protecting something they believed mattered more than money. The sacred ground where ancestors slept, waiting for the living to remember they were more than obstacles to development. "Mr. Carter," Victoria's voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Ethan set down his coffee, descended the porch steps. "Didn't seem like I had much choice. Your people have been watching the property." A slight smile, neither warm nor cold, just acknowledgement of fact. "Due diligence. This land has been on our acquisition list for 70 years. I like to know what I'm dealing with." "And what are you dealing with?" Victoria's gaze sharpened. "That's what I'm here to find out. May we speak inside?" Ethan led her into the house, through rooms that probably looked shabby to her corporate eyes, into William's study where 3 generations of secrets waited to ambush them both. He gestured to the chair across from the desk. Victoria sat with perfect posture, the kind drilled into people by expensive schools and expensive expectations. "I'll be direct." Victoria folded her hands in her lap. "Hartwell Mining is prepared to offer you $15 million for this property. That's 3 times the agricultural value, double our previous best offer. It's more than generous for land that hasn't turned a profit in decades." Ethan settled into William's chair, felt the leather familiar against his back. "And if I refuse? Then you'll face legal challenges, environmental assessments, probably county violations we've already documented." Her tone remained pleasant, factual. "I have 3 lawyers on retainer who specialize in disputed inheritances. They tell me your claim is vulnerable. Because I'm not William's biological son." Victoria's mask slipped for just a second, surprise flickering across her features before control reasserted itself. "You know about that." "I know a lot of things." Ethan opened the desk drawer, pulled out the box of documents Eleanor had given him. "The question is, how much do you know?" "I know your father was eccentric, possibly unstable toward the end." Victoria's voice careful now, sensing trap. "I know he had some delusion about this land being protected, about sacred sites and federal designations that don't actually prevent development." Ethan slid the first document across the desk. "Federal Geological Survey Report, 1953. Strategic Mineral Reserve designation under the Defense Production Act. Still legally valid, never rescinded. Victoria picked it up, scanned it quickly. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, became more focused. This is 70 years old. Legal precedent doesn't expire. Ethan handed her another document. Mining claims, property transfers, shell companies. 70 years of Hartwell Mining systematically acquiring land around this property, waiting for the moment you could access the copper deposit that runs beneath all of it. She read in silence, and Ethan watched her face, looking for the moment recognition would dawn. Victoria Hartwell was intelligent, successful, ruthless when needed, but she was also human, and humans had breaking points. This is impressive research. Victoria set down the documents, but it doesn't change the fundamental reality. The mineral designation is a technicality that can be challenged. The land is yours to sell, and $15 million is generational wealth for a man with no family, no children, no one to pass it to. The words landed like she'd intended, designed to wound, to remind Ethan of his isolation. But he'd spent 3 years grieving Sarah, learning to live with emptiness. Victoria's verbal knives found nothing soft to cut. Instead, Ethan pulled out the photographs. Thomas Carter in uniform. Thomas with Sarah. Thomas standing with Joseph Redfeather beside the mine entrance. Who is that? Victoria's voice steady, but something flickered in her eyes. Thomas Carter, my uncle, or rather, my biological father. Ethan watched her carefully. He discovered the copper in 1951. He also discovered the Cheyenne burial caves the deposit runs beneath. He made a promise to protect those sacred sites. Ancient history. Victoria's dismissal, quick, too quick. Whatever promises your father made don't bind you. Uncle, Ethan corrected. Thomas was my father. William raised me, but Thomas was blood, and Thomas made that promise for deploying to Korea, where he was captured and spent 40 years in a North Korean prisoner camp. He slid the POW documents across the desk. Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she picked them up, the first real crack in her professional armor. According to military intelligence, Thomas survived until at least 1995. Ethan continued, voice gentle now because what came next would hurt. Before his capture, he'd fathered a daughter. A Korean woman gave birth to his child in early 1951, just months before Thomas was taken prisoner. Victoria set down the documents carefully, precisely, like someone trying to maintain control through ritual. Why are you telling me this? Because that infant daughter was placed in an orphanage after her mother died in 1953. Ethan pulled out the adoption certificate. She was adopted in 1962 by Douglas Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Mining Corporation, when she was 11 years old. Her birth name was Carter Sue Jin. Her adopted name became Victoria Hartwell. The silence that followed, stretched like wire, pulled to breaking point. Victoria's face had gone pale, her breathing shallow and controlled. Outside, wind rattled the windows, the Montana sky darkening with clouds that promised rain. You're lying, Victoria's voice barely audible. I wish I was. Ethan slid over the final document. DNA analysis would confirm it, but the paper trail is clear. Thomas Carter is your biological father. The land you've spent 15 years trying to acquire for Hartwell Mining is your father's legacy, the promise he made before the war took him. Victoria stood abruptly, moved to the window, stared out at land that was suddenly more than an asset to be liquidated. Ethan gave her time, understanding that some truths required space to be absorbed. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of its earlier confidence. Douglas Hartwell never told me. 73 years I've been alive. 40 of those years, he was my father, and he never said I was adopted. Some parents don't. Ethan's tone careful, trying to offer understanding without presumption. Some think it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that love is thicker than blood, but it does matter. Victoria turned, and her eyes were wet, though no tears had fallen. It matters when you spend your life trying to please a father who wasn't yours. It matters when you destroy other families to build a legacy for people who took you from your real family. They didn't know. Ethan stood, moved toward her, but didn't cross the space between them, respecting her need for distance. The adoption was legal, handled through international agencies after the Korean War. Douglas Hartwell probably thought he was saving a war orphan. He was. Victoria's laugh bitter. An 11-year-old girl who'd spent 9 years in orphanages, who barely spoke English, who had no memory of parents or family. But he was also acquiring the biological heir to the land he'd spent decades trying to steal. The perfect long game. Raise Thomas Carter's daughter to run the company that would destroy Thomas Carter's legacy. I don't think it was that calculated, don't you? Victoria's anger surfacing now, better than the vulnerability that had preceded it. Hartwell Mining knew about the burial caves, knew about Thomas's promise to the Cheyenne people. My father, my adoptive father, he must have known he was taking Thomas's daughter and turning her into the weapon that would finally break the Carter family's resistance. Ethan had considered this possibility, turned it over in his mind during sleepless nights. But he'd concluded differently. Douglas Hartwell was ruthless, yes, but also human. The adoption records showed a man whose wife couldn't have children, who'd wanted family, who'd seen an opportunity to do good while also perhaps serving long-term business interests. I think he loved you, Ethan said quietly. Whatever else he was, whatever the company did, I think he genuinely loved you as his daughter. Then why didn't he tell me? Victoria's voice breaking. Why let me live a lie? Maybe because he was afraid. Afraid you'd hate him for it. Afraid you'd choose your birth family over him. Afraid the truth would destroy the relationship you'd built. Victoria returned to the chair, sat heavily, looking older suddenly, the weight of 73 years settling on her like snow accumulating. I've spent my entire adult life building Hartwell Mining, 15 years as CEO, hundreds of employees depending on me, billions in assets, and fighting your own family without knowing it. Am I? Victoria looked up, meeting his eyes. Are we family, Ethan? We share a biological father we've never met. That's genetics, not kinship. It's a start. For what? Ethan returned to his chair, pulled out the final document from William's box. A letter sealed, addressed to Victoria Hartwell in William's handwriting. My father, my uncle, whoever William was to me, he knew about you for at least a year before he died. He investigated, confirmed the connection, and chose not to reach out. But he left this. Victoria took the letter with shaking hands. Should I open it now? That's up to you. She broke the seal carefully. Unfolded pages covered in William's precise script. Ethan watched emotions play across her face as she read. Surprise, grief, anger. Something that might have been relief. When she finished, Victoria sat motionless for a long moment, the letter resting in her lap. He apologizes. Her voice distant, processing. Says he's sorry for what happened to Thomas. Sorry I grew up not knowing my real father. Sorry the circumstances made us enemies instead of family. He says Thomas was the best man he ever knew. And if I have any of Thomas in me, I should understand that some things matter more than profit. She looked at Ethan with eyes that held decades of certainty crumbling. He asked me to choose, to honor my biological father's promise or honor my adoptive father's company. He says both are valid, both have claims on my loyalty, and no one can make the choice except me. What will you choose? Victoria folded the letter carefully, precisely, a gesture that bought time to think. I don't know. I've built my entire identity around being a Hartwell, around leading the company, around succeeding where others failed. Learning I'm actually a Carter, that I've been fighting against my own father's dying wish. That changes everything. It doesn't have to change anything, Ethan offered. You can still choose the company. Choose profit. Choose to develop this land the way Hartwell has wanted for 70 years. I can't stop you, not really. The courts will probably side with you eventually. But you're hoping I won't. I'm hoping you'll take time to decide. Meet with Joseph Redfeather. See the burial caves. Understand what Thomas was protecting. Then make an informed choice. Victoria stood, composed herself with visible effort. I need to think. This is too much to process in one conversation. Take whatever time you need. She moved toward the door, paused. If I choose to honor Thomas's promise, Hartwell Mining's board will remove me as CEO. The company is deep in debt. The copper deposit under this land is our only viable path to solvency. Without it, we face bankruptcy. Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her choice. Some decisions cost us everything. Yes. Victoria's smile, sad, exhausted. They do. After she left, Ethan sat in William's study watching dust motes dance in afternoon light, thinking about the conversation, about Victoria's face when she learned the truth, about the impossible position they'd both inherited from men long dead. His phone rang. Eleanor's number. How did it go? The librarian's voice cautious, as well as could be expected. Ethan rubbed his eyes, suddenly exhausted. She knows. She's processing. I don't know what she'll decide. Neither does she, probably. Eleanor sighed, but there's something else you need to know. Something I should have told you earlier, but William made me promise to wait. What? Your father's death. The accident. Eleanor's voice heavy. It wasn't entirely an accident. Ethan's chest tightened. Hartwell had him killed. No. Eleanor's paws stretched. William did it himself. The words didn't make sense initially. Ethan tried to parse them, fit them into the framework of what he knew, but they remained stubbornly incomprehensible. What are you saying? I'm saying William cut his own brake lines. Eleanor's voice thick with old grief. He was terminal, Ethan. Stage 4 cancer, maybe 2 weeks left. Dr. Raymond Chen had offered palliative care, hospice, morphine to make the end bearable. William refused. Why? Because he wanted to die on his terms, not cancer's terms, Eleanor explained. And because he wanted you to come home thinking Hartwell had killed him. Wanted you angry enough, motivated enough to stay and fight. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. He manipulated me. He gave you a reason, Eleanor's tone defensive of William's choice. You wouldn't have come home for his funeral if you thought it was just old age or illness. You'd proven that by missing your mother's funeral. But murder? That was something you couldn't ignore. So he staged his own death to look like assassination. Dr. Chen tried to stop him. Eleanor continued, tried to convince him there were better ways. But William was done, Ethan. Done with pain, done with waiting, done with the slow dissolution of everything he'd been. He wanted dignity, and he wanted you home. The truck accident gave him both. Ethan stood, paced the study, anger and grief, and something like respect warring in his chest. All of this, the inheritance, the secrets, the carefully orchestrated revelation of truth, William had planned it all like a military campaign, moving pieces into position even as cancer consumed him. Is there anything else you've been waiting to tell me? Ethan's voice sharp. Any other bombs you're supposed to drop at the appropriate dramatic moment? Just one. Eleanor's tone apologetic. William left another letter. Dr. Chen has it. You're supposed to receive it after you've spoken with Victoria and learned about the suicide. I'll let him know you're ready. Dr. Raymond Chen's office sat above the town's only pharmacy, accessible by stairs that creaked with age, and memories of patients who'd climbed them seeking healing, or at least comfort. The doctor himself was 68, silver-haired and kind-eyed, the sort of man who'd spent a lifetime bearing witness to human suffering and still managed to believe in goodness. He welcomed Ethan into an office that smelled like old books and antiseptic, gestured to a worn leather chair that had probably supported thousands of worried patients over the decades. Eleanor called. Dr. Chen settled behind his desk. Said you were ready for the final letter. Did you know? Ethan asked. About all of it? The secrets, the planning, the manipulation? Some of it. Dr. Chen pulled a sealed envelope from a locked drawer. William was my patient for 35 years. I knew about the cancer, about his investigations into Thomas's fate, about his decision to end things on his own terms. I didn't know about the strategic aspects, the way he'd structured the inheritance to force you home. You helped him die. I gave him information about how brake systems work. Dr. Chen's voice steady, unashamed. I refused to actively participate in his death, but I understood his reasoning. Terminal cancer is a brutal way to die, Ethan. The pain becomes unmanageable. The morphine makes you someone you're not. William wanted to be himself at the end, even if the end came by his own hand. Is that legal? It's complicated. Dr. Chen offered a sad smile. Montana doesn't have death with dignity laws. What William did was technically suicide, which means technically I could face charges for assisting. But he left extensive documentation absolving me, explaining his decision was fully informed and independent. He thought of everything. He had a year to plan after the final diagnosis. Dr. Chen handed over the envelope. This is what he wanted you to have, after you knew the whole truth. Ethan broke the seal, unfolded pages that had become familiar. William's handwriting precise despite what must have been significant pain. The letter began without preamble, straight to the point in typical William fashion. Son, if you're reading this, Dr. Chen has told you how I died. Not an accident, not Hartwell's doing. My choice, made in sound mind, executed with the same precision I tried to bring to everything. I'm sorry for the deception. Sorry for making you think my death was murder when it was mercy. But I needed you home, and I knew rage would bring you faster than guilt. By now you've met Victoria, Learn she's your cousin, your sister in blood, if not in upbringing. You've seen the weight she carries, the impossible position I've left her in. That was intentional, though perhaps cruel. Here's what I couldn't tell her, but need you to understand. Thomas made his promise to the Cheyenne people, not just out of principle, but out of love. He'd fallen in love with the daughter of Joseph Redfeather, the elder, a young woman named Morningstar who taught him about sacred ground and ancestral duty. When Thomas deployed, Morningstar was pregnant, not with Victoria, that came from a different relationship during his time in Korea. Morningstar carried Thomas's first child, a son who would have been born in 1952 if complications during birth hadn't taken both mother and baby. That loss devastated Joseph Redfeather. He'd lost his daughter and grandson, but he'd gained a promise from Thomas that their deaths would mean something, that the sacred ground Morningstar had loved would be protected. I kept that promise for 60 years, not just for Thomas, but for Morningstar and the child who never lived. Their graves are in the burial caves you haven't seen yet. When you visit, you'll understand why this fight matters. Victoria doesn't know this part. She thinks Thomas's promise was abstract, principled, but impersonal. She needs to know it was personal, born from love and loss. That knowledge might change how she views her choice. I'm giving you this information to use as you see fit. Tell Victoria or don't. Share it with Joseph Redfeather or keep it private. I trust your judgment in ways I never learned to trust my own. You asked me once, when you were young and we were fighting, why I was so cold, so distant, so incapable of showing affection. I didn't have an answer then. I do now. I was afraid of loving you the way I loved Thomas and losing you the same way. Afraid of being close enough to hurt when the inevitable separation came. So I kept you at arm's length, told myself it was protection when it was really cowardice. Your mother understood. Sarah knew I was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed, only managed. She loved me anyway, God knows why, and she loved you with enough warmth for both of us. When she died, I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap we'd both built. But 25 years of distance makes a canyon that can't be crossed with words. So I settled for this, a letter from beyond death, hoping you'll understand what I couldn't say when I could still look you in the eye. I'm proud of you. Proud of the man you became despite my failures as a father figure. Proud that you survived war, marriage, loss, failure, and kept moving forward. Proud that you're stubborn enough to stay this year, even knowing how hard it will be. You're more like Thomas than you know. He was stubborn too, principled when it cost him, brave when fear was the smarter choice. Those qualities got him captured and imprisoned, but they also made him someone worth remembering. Be like him if you can. Keep the promise. Protect the sacred ground. Stand between profit and principle and refuse to move even when moving seems easier. But if you can't, if the weight is too much, if you choose to sell and walk away, know that I'll understand. Some burdens are too heavy for one man to carry alone. I carried this one for 60 years and it nearly crushed me. I won't judge you for choosing differently. Whatever you decide, know this. You were my son, not by blood but by choice, by years of quiet meals and shared work, and the thousand small moments that make a family. I failed to show it, failed to say it, but I felt it every day. Forgive me for the deception. Forgive me for the coldness. Forgive me for leaving you this impossible inheritance. And if you can't forgive, at least understand. Some men don't know how to love except by fighting for what they love. I fought for you the only way I knew how, by pushing you away to keep you safe. It was wrong, I see that now, at the end, but it was the best I could do. Your father, in all the ways that matter, William. Ethan set down the letter, vision blurred with tears he hadn't known were coming. 58 years old, a lifetime of resentment and anger and carefully maintained distance. And it turned out William had been afraid. Just afraid. Not cruel, not cold by nature, just terrified of attachment, because attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant loss. He wept then, not for William's death, but for the relationship they could have had if either of them had been brave enough to risk honesty. Wept for Thomas, imprisoned for 40 years while his family thought him dead. Wept for Morningstar and her unborn child, buried beneath land that men wanted to tear apart for profit. Dr. Chen sat quietly, offering presents without platitudes, understanding that some grief needed witness, but not commentary. When Ethan could speak again, his voice came rough and broken. Did he suffer? At the end, Dr. Chen shook his head. The accident was quick. He was dead before the truck stopped rolling. He made sure of that. Small mercy. Yes. Ethan stood, folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his jacket next to his heart. Thank you for telling me, for helping him, for carrying this secret until I was ready. Dr. Chen stood as well, offered his hand. Your father was a good man trapped in an impossible situation. I hope you can remember him that way. I'm trying. The drive back to the ranch took Ethan through town as afternoon faded toward evening, past houses where families were gathering for dinner, past the high school where practice fields held teenagers playing games that mattered intensely in the moment and not at all in the long view. Normal lives, normal problems, the kind of existence Ethan had tried to build after the military and failed to maintain after Sarah died. He understood now why he'd failed. Because he was a Carter, and Carters didn't get normal lives. They got secrets and promises and the weight of generations pressing down until either you learned to carry it or it crushed you completely. Marcus's BMW sat in the ranch driveway again, but this time Marcus stood outside it, pacing, agitated. He rushed toward Ethan's truck as soon as it stopped. We've got a problem. Marcus's face pale, frightened. Hartwell called me, said Victoria's having some kind of breakdown, said she's talking about shutting down the acquisition, said the board is moving to remove her as CEO. Ethan climbed out slowly, processing. How do you know this? They want me to convince you to sell quickly before Victoria can be officially removed and the board appoints someone harder to negotiate with. Marcus's words tumbling out fast, desperate. They're offering $20 million now. Take it or leave it in the next 48 hours. And you're telling me this because they mentioned that accidents can be arranged. Marcus met his eyes, genuine fear there. They mentioned your father's brake lines, said they could make similar arrangements if you continued to be difficult. Ethan felt cold clarity settle over him. They're threatening to kill me. They're threatening to kill both of us, Marcus corrected. Said I've become a liability, that I know too much, that loose ends need tying up. I thought I was working with businessmen, Ethan. I didn't sign up for murder. What do you want me to do? Fight back. Marcus's voice firmer now, decision made. I'll testify to everything. The bribes they offered, the threats they made, the way they've been watching the property. I'll wear a wire, record conversations, whatever you need. Why the change of heart? Because I'm 65 years dirty and I don't even want us to manage for someone else's copper mine. Marcus's honesty raw, unvarnished. And because maybe William was right. Maybe some things matter more than money. Before Ethan could respond, headlights appeared on the gravel road. Not one vehicle, but three. Black SUVs moving fast, purposeful. They parked in a semicircle, trapping Ethan and Marcus against the house. Men emerged from the vehicles, 6 of them, dressed in casual clothes that didn't quite hide the professional violence in their postures. Not local thugs. These were specialists, the kind you hired when you needed problems solved permanently. The lead man approached, early 40s, military bearing, the kind of operator Ethan recognized from his own service days. Private military contractor, probably earning tax-free money doing things governments couldn't officially sanction. Mr. Carter, the man's voice flat, professional. My employer would like to resolve this situation peacefully. We're authorized to offer you $25 million for immediate transfer of property rights. Ethan glanced at Marcus, who'd gone pale and still. And if I refuse? Then we're authorized to solve the problem through alternative means. The contractor's tone didn't change, discussing murder the way someone might discuss shipping options. Nothing personal, just business. Whose business? Ethan asked, buying time, assessing options. Victoria Hartwell's? The contractor smiled, cold and empty. Ms. Hartwell is no longer in a position to make decisions for the company. The board has assumed direct control of critical acquisitions, meaning they'd removed her, meaning she's been placed on administrative leave pending performance review. The contractor gestured to his men, who began spreading out, surrounding the property. You have 2 minutes to decide, Mr. Carter. $25 million and you walk away, or we move to alternative solutions. Ethan's mind raced through possibilities. He was 58, out of practice, armed only with whatever was in the house. Marcus was useless in a fight. 6 professional operators against 2 middle-aged men made this an execution, not a confrontation. But Ethan had spent 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, some of it in combat zones, enough to know that tactical situations change based on information and timing. I need to make a call first. Ethan kept his voice steady. Let my lawyer know I'm transferring the property. The contractor nodded. One call, speakerphone. Ethan pulled out his cell, dialed Eleanor's number, prayed she'd understand what he needed. She answered on the second ring. Eleanor, it's Ethan. I've decided to accept the Hartwell offer. Could you contact Sheriff Cross and let him know I'll need witness signatures on the transfer documents? There was a pause, then Eleanor's voice came back careful, understanding. Of course. I'll call the sheriff right now. He should be there in about 10 minutes with the necessary paperwork. Thank you. Ethan hung up, met the contractor's eyes. My lawyer is sending the sheriff with documents. 10 minutes. The contractor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Calculation replacing certainty. Having law enforcement arrive complicated things, turned a clean elimination into a messy situation that would require explanations. 10 minutes. The contractor agreed. Then we proceed one way or another. The wait stretched like wire pulled to breaking. Marcus stood frozen, probably running through the same calculations Ethan was. Even if the sheriff arrived, even if Eleanor had understood the coded message, they were still facing 6 armed professionals who'd been hired to solve a problem. Headlights appeared on the gravel road, but not from town. From the east, across Carter property, where no road existed. Trucks, 4 of them, emerging from the darkness like ghosts. They parked in a line between the contractors and the ranch house, and men emerged. Native American men, tribal security based on the patches on their jackets. Leading them was Joseph Redfeather, the younger, grandson of the elder, perhaps 40 years old and carrying the kind of presence that came from legitimate authority. Evening, gentlemen? Joseph's voice carried clearly across the distance. This is tribal land, protected under federal treaty. You're trespassing. The contractor's confidence faltered. This is private property. This is sacred ground under federal protection. Joseph gestured to his men, who fanned out with practiced efficiency. We've been monitoring it since William Carter's death, making sure no one desecrates the burial sites. You want to leave now, or you want to explain to federal marshals why you're armed on protected indigenous territory? The standoff held for a long moment, professional violence meeting legitimate authority, neither backing down, but both calculating odds. Then headlights from town, the sheriff's cruiser moving fast, lights flashing. Sheriff Cross emerged with 2 deputies, hand near his weapon, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. Someone want to tell me what's happening here? Cross's voice hard, cop serious. The contractor made his decision, gestured to his men. They retreated to their vehicles smoothly, professionally, a tactical withdrawal rather than a rout. Before climbing into the lead SUV, the contractor looked at Ethan one last time. This isn't over. Then they were gone, taillights disappearing into Montana darkness, leaving Ethan and Marcus standing with unlikely allies under a sky bright with indifferent stars. Joseph approached, offered his hand. My grandfather asked me to watch over you. Seems like good timing. Ethan shook it, gratitude making his throat tight. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Joseph's expression serious. Those men will be back, probably with more resources, definitely with better planning. You can't stay here alone. I'm not leaving. Then you need protection. Joseph looked at the ranch house, the land spreading dark and infinite around them. My people can maintain a presence, but we're not a private army. You need legal protection, federal protection, something that makes killing you more trouble than it's worth. Sheriff Cross approached, looking older and more tired than Ethan remembered. Eleanor called, said you were in trouble. Glad we got here in time. He glanced at the tribal security team. Glad you did too, Joseph. What can you do? Ethan asked. Officially, Cross sighed. Officially, not much. Those men didn't commit a crime I can prove. They'll claim they were security consultants checking on property that's under negotiation. Without recordings or witnesses willing to testify, I've got nothing. Unofficially? Unofficially, I can tell you that Hartwell Mining has friends in high places. County attorney, district judge, probably the state attorney general. You're fighting money and political connections that go back decades. Then I need to make this public. Ethan decided. National media, federal attention, somewhere Hartwell can't reach. Marcus stepped forward, finding his voice. I'll testify. Everything I know, everyone I've talked to, all the bribes and threats, I'll make it public. Cross looked at him with something like respect. You know that makes you a target too. I'm already a target. Marcus's voice steady now, fear transformed into purpose. Might as well make it count for something. The ranch house stood in darkness behind them, 300 acres of promises and graves and copper worth millions buried beneath sacred soil. Ethan looked at the land his grandfather had died protecting, his father had lived defending, his uncle had loved enough to make impossible promises. Some burdens were too heavy for one man, but maybe with allies, with family blood new and family choice created, maybe the weight could be distributed. Maybe promises made 70 years ago could be kept by people who understood that some things mattered more than survival. Call your grandfather, Ethan said to Joseph. Tell him I'm ready to see the burial caves. I need to understand fully what I'm protecting. Joseph nodded. Tomorrow at dawn, come alone. What you'll see isn't meant for crowds. After everyone left, Ethan sat on the porch in darkness, listening to Montana wind whisper through grass that had grown wild in William's absence. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Victoria Hartwell's voice came through, exhausted and broken. They voted me out. The board removed me as CEO effective immediately. I heard. I told them I wouldn't authorize acquisition of the Carter property. Told them about Thomas, about the burial caves, about the sacred promise. She laughed bitterly. They called me emotionally compromised, said I'd lost objectivity, had me escorted from the building like a criminal. I'm sorry. Don't be. Victoria's voice carried something that might have been relief beneath the pain. For the first time in 73 years, I'm free. Free from Douglas Hartwell's expectations. Free from company loyalty. Free to choose who I want to be instead of who I was raised to be. What will you do? Victoria was quiet for a moment. I'm coming back to Montana, to the ranch. I want to see the burial caves. Want to stand where Thomas stood when he made his promise. Want to understand the man whose blood I carry, even if I never knew his name. You're welcome here. Are we family, Ethan, really? I think we're becoming family. That's close enough. After the call ended, Ethan remained on the porch until stars faded with approaching dawn. Tomorrow he'd see the burial caves, understand the final piece of the puzzle William had left him. Tomorrow Victoria would return, seeking connection to a father she'd never known. Tomorrow the fight would continue, escalate, probably become more dangerous. But tonight, in this moment between darkness and dawn, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, not the hollow purpose of survival, but the kind that came from standing for something larger than yourself. Some men fought for country, some for family, some for principles they couldn't quite articulate, but knew in their bones mattered. Ethan would fight for all three, for Thomas's memory, for William's sacrifice, for Victoria's chance at redemption, for Joseph's ancestors sleeping beneath Montana soil, for the promise that bound them all across generations in grief and the impossible weight of doing right when wrong was so much easier. Dawn came slowly, light creeping across the eastern pasture, illuminating land worth fighting for not because of what lay beneath it, but because of who lay beneath it, sleeping forever, waiting for the living to remember that some graves were too sacred to disturb for any price. Dawn broke cold and clear over Montana, the kind of morning that made a man feel both insignificant and eternal, dwarfed by mountains that had stood for millennia and would stand long after his bones turned to dust. Ethan met Joseph Redfeather at the eastern boundary of the ranch, where fence posts gave way to dense forest, the transition from Carterland to what maps called state forest, but what older agreements recognized as something else entirely. Joseph arrived on foot, moving through the trees with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew this land in his blood. He wore traditional clothing today, not the jeans and jacket of their previous meeting, and his face carried the ceremonial gravity of a man about to share sacred knowledge. This way, Joseph's voice barely above a whisper, not from fear but from respect. What you're about to see, very few outsiders have witnessed. I'm showing you because my grandfather believes you've earned the right, because Thomas Carter earned it 70 years ago. They walked in silence, following paths that weren't quite paths, routes that existed more from memory and tradition than from physical marking. The forest grew denser, older, trees that had been saplings when Lewis and Clark first mapped this territory, their trunks thick enough that 3 men couldn't encircle them with joined hands. After 20 minutes, the ground began to slope downward, rocky outcroppings appearing like bones pushing through Earth's skin. Joseph led them to what appeared to be a natural cave entrance, half hidden by overgrowth that looked wild, but on closer inspection had been carefully cultivated to conceal. Joseph paused at the entrance, pulled out tobacco, sprinkled it in a circle around the opening, while speaking words in Cheyenne that Ethan couldn't understand but felt in his chest. Syllables that carried weight beyond language. "We asked permission to enter," Joseph explained after finishing. "The ancestors sleep here. We don't disturb them without acknowledging our debt." He produced a flashlight, modern technology in service of ancient purpose, and led them inside. The cave opened gradually, narrow passage giving way to a chamber that took Ethan's breath away. The walls glowed in the flashlight beam, copper veins running through rock like blood through veins, the richest concentration Ethan had seen in any geological survey. But that wasn't what made him stop breathing. The chamber held remains, dozens of burial platforms built according to old traditions, elevated above the cave floor, each holding what had been a person, a life, a story now reduced to bones and ceremony. Joseph moved among the platforms with practiced ease, stopping at one that looked newer than the others, perhaps 70 years old rather than 200. "Morning star," Joseph said quietly, shining light on remains wrapped in ceremonial cloth, a smaller bundle beside them. "And her son, who never drew breath. Thomas Carter's first family, the ones most people never knew existed." Ethan approached slowly, understanding hitting him like physical force. Thomas hadn't made a promise to strangers. He'd made a vow to protect the resting place of the woman he'd loved and the child they'd lost. This wasn't abstract principle. This was grief transformed into purpose. "My grandfather told me the story." Joseph's voice carried through the chamber, respectful of the dead, but meant for the living. "Thomas came here in spring of 1951, young and full of certainty the way young men are. He was surveying the eastern boundary for your grandfather, looking for fence damage, when he found copper exposed in the creek bed." Joseph moved to another section of the cave, pointing to where the copper vein was most visible, green and pure, worth millions to anyone who saw only mineral value. He brought a sample to town, had it assayed, and word spread fast the way it does in small places. Within a week, Hartwell Mining sent representatives, offering money your family had never imagined, money that could transform everything. But Thomas had also met Morningstar by then. Joseph returned to her burial platform. "She was my grandfather's daughter, 20 years old, studying to be a teacher. She showed Thomas these caves, explained their significance, told him about the ancestors who'd been laid here according to traditions older than the country claiming jurisdiction over them." Joseph sat on a natural stone bench, gestured for Ethan to join him. Thomas fell in love twice that spring, once with Morningstar, once with the idea that some things mattered more than money. When Hartwell made their offer, he refused. Not because of principle alone, but because accepting meant desecrating the grave of the woman carrying his child. "What happened to her?" "Complications during birth." Joseph's voice heavy with old sorrow. 1952, early spring. The baby came early, something went wrong. By the time they got her to a hospital, it was too late. She died holding Thomas's hand, made him promise to protect this place, protect her people's traditions, protect the ancestors sleeping here. And then he deployed. 2 weeks after her funeral. Joseph nodded, went to Korea carrying grief like stones in his pockets. "My grandfather said Thomas looked like a man already dead, just waiting for his body to catch up with his spirit. But he survived, in a manner of speaking." Joseph stood, led Ethan deeper into the cave system, through passages that showed evidence of recent exploration, boot prints in dust, survey markers left by people who had no business being here. Hartwell's people have been probing these caves for decades. Every generation thinks they can find a way to extract the copper without disturbing the graves. Every generation fails because the deposit runs directly beneath this chamber. They emerged into a second chamber, smaller but more spectacular. The walls nearly solid copper, enough mineral wealth to pay off national debts, buy elections, build empires. And all of it inseparable from the bones of people who died before copper had monetary value, when it was just metal for tools and ornaments, useful but not sacred in itself. This is what they want. Joseph's gesture encompassing the glowing walls. This is what 3 generations of Hartwell executives have dreamed about, schemed for, killed for. Copper pure enough to make them billionaires, if only they could move the inconvenient dead. "Can't they mine around it?" Ethan asked, though he suspected the answer. Joseph shook his head. "The deposit is shaped like a bowl, this chamber at the center. Any extraction destabilizes the whole system. The graves collapse, the ancestors are disturbed, and for what? So rich men can become richer? They stood in silence, surrounded by wealth that couldn't be spent and death that couldn't be reversed. The fundamental conflict that had consumed 3 generations laid bare in rock and bone, and the eternal question of what mattered more, profit or principle. What would Thomas want me to do? Ethan finally asked. Joseph turned, met his eyes. Thomas would want you to choose freely. He made his promise out of love. You have to make yours out of understanding. No one can tell you what's right except your own conscience. They emerged from the caves into morning light that seemed harsh after the soft darkness below. Ethan's eyes adjusted slowly, and he noticed Victoria Hartwell standing at the forest edge, flanked by 2 tribal security guards who'd clearly intercepted her approach. She came at dawn, one of the guards explained, said she needed to see you. We told her to wait. Ethan nodded, let her approach. Victoria walked forward carefully, dressed for hiking rather than boardrooms, looking years younger without the corporate armor, years older without the certainty that had defined her. She stopped a respectful distance away. Joseph told me on the phone what I'd find here. Victoria's voice quiet. Sacred burial grounds. Thomas's first family. The reason the promise mattered. Did you still want to see? More than ever. Joseph looked at Ethan, who nodded permission. The 3 of them descended back into the earth, retracing the path to the first chamber, to Morningstar's resting place. Victoria stood before the burial platform for a long time, silent, processing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried tears, though her face remained dry. He loved her. Not just the idea of her, but actually loved her. This is why he fought so hard, why he made a promise that bound 3 generations. Yes, and I've spent 15 years trying to destroy what he died protecting. Victoria's laugh bitter. The board was right. I'm emotionally compromised. How could I not be? Everything I built was built on desecrating my father's grave. You didn't know. Does that matter? Victoria turned, and her eyes held decades of certainty crumbling. I was CEO. I authorized surveys, hired security, pushed legal challenges. Ignorance doesn't absolve me of responsibility. Joseph had been standing quietly, observing. Now he spoke. You can't change the past, only choose the future. What future? Victoria's gesture encompassing the chamber. Hartwell Mining's board will keep pushing. They've removed me, so I have no authority to stop them. The company is deep in debt, desperate for this copper. They'll use every legal trick, every political connection, every form of pressure until they get it. Or until someone stops them, Ethan said. How? Victoria's question genuine. You're one man with a contested inheritance. I'm a disgraced former CEO with no power. Joseph's people can provide security, but not legal protection. Hartwell has lawyers, politicians, judges. They've been building this network for 70 years. Ethan thought about William's letter, about the federal designation that had been buried but never rescinded, about the evidence Eleanor had compiled showing decades of corporate malfeasance. Alone, any single piece was insufficient. Together, they might be enough. We go public. Ethan decided. National media, federal investigation. We make this about more than one ranch in Montana. We make it about corporate corruption, indigenous rights, sacred site protection. We make it politically toxic for anyone to side with Hartwell. They'll destroy us first, Victoria said. I know how they operate. Silence witnesses, bury evidence, make people disappear into legal proceedings that bankrupt them before trial. Then we move fast. Ethan pulled out his phone. I know a producer at 60 Minutes, served with her brother in the Corps. She owes me a favor. The call lasted 15 minutes, Ethan laying out the story in broad strokes while Victoria and Joseph listened. 70 years of harassment, federal designations ignored, sacred burial grounds threatened. A CEO learning her biological father was the man whose legacy her company was trying to destroy. By the time he finished, the producer was already mobilizing a crew. They'll be here tomorrow, Ethan reported. Full investigative team. If we give them everything, documents, testimony, access to the caves, they can have a story ready to air within a week. That's not enough time. Victoria's protest immediate. Hartwell's board will move faster. They've already started preliminary surveys on the eastern boundary. They're not waiting for legal permission anymore. Then we stop them now, Joseph said simply. Tribal security can establish a perimeter, declare the caves protected under federal indigenous rights. Anyone who crosses that line commits a federal crime. They'll cross anyway. Victoria's knowledge of her former company clear. They're beyond caring about crimes they think they can pay their way out of. Then they'll be arrested. Joseph's tone final. And we'll have federal marshals involved, which brings federal attention, which is what we want. The plan came together with the strange clarity that sometimes emerged from desperate circumstances, each piece falling into place because there were no other pieces available. Joseph would mobilize tribal security and contact federal authorities. Victoria would provide internal Hartwell documents showing the history of corporate malfeasance. Ethan would coordinate media coverage and prepare testimony. They separated at the cave entrance. Three people bound by blood they were just learning to acknowledge, heading in different directions to prepare for a fight that could end any number of ways, most of them badly. Ethan drove back to the ranch, mind racing through logistics and possibilities, so focused on planning that he almost missed the nausea rising in his throat, the sudden exhaustion that made steering difficult. He pulled over, breathed deeply, told himself it was stress, just stress, the accumulated weight of revelation and responsibility. But the nausea didn't pass, neither did the exhaustion. And there was something else, a deep ache in his lower back that he'd been ignoring for weeks, attributing to age and poor sleeping and the physical demands of ranch work. He made it home, collapsed on William's old couch, and woke 3 hours later feeling worse, not better. The kind of worse that spoke of something wrong on a fundamental level, cells betraying their host, systems failing in ways that couldn't be ignored. Dr. Raymond Chen's office was closing when Ethan called, but the doctor heard something in his voice that prompted immediate attention. Come now. Chen's order clear. Don't wait until morning. The examination was thorough and increasingly concerning, Chen's face growing more grave with each finding. He ordered blood work, sent samples to the lab with a rush request, told Ethan to wait in the office. 2 hours later, the results came back. Chen reviewed them in silence, checked them twice, then looked at Ethan with the expression doctors wore when delivering news that changed everything. I need to send you to Billings for a full workup, Chen's voice professionally gentle. But based on these numbers and your symptoms, I suspect we're looking at advanced prostate cancer. The words landed without immediate impact, like bullets that hurt less in the moment of impact than in the seconds after when the damage became clear. Ethan sat in the same chair William must have sat in when receiving his own diagnosis. 35 years of fighting the same disease before it finally won. Like father, like son, Ethan's laugh empty. Like uncle, technically. Chen's attempt at lightness fell flat. But yes, there's likely a genetic component. PSA levels this high usually indicate stage 3 or 4. We won't know for certain until we do imaging and biopsy. But I won't lie to you, Ethan. This is serious. How long? Chen hesitated. With treatment, anywhere from 2 to 5 years. Without treatment, significantly less. But treatment options have improved dramatically since William's time. You have a real chance at meaningful survival. Meaningful survival. Ethan tested the phrase, found it wanting. What's meaningful about spending my last years in hospitals fighting a battle I'll eventually lose? That's not a medical question, Chen said gently. That's a philosophical one. What makes life meaningful isn't duration, but how we spend whatever time we have. William chose to die on his own terms. William was 73 with terminal stage 4 cancer, Chen's voice firm. You're 58 with potentially treatable stage 3. The situations are not equivalent. You have options he didn't. Ethan stood, feeling every one of his 58 years in joints that protested movement, in muscles that had started the subtle decline that accelerated after 50 and never stopped. He'd watched Sarah die of cancer, held her hand through chemo and radiation, and the terrible final weeks when nothing helped except morphine and lies about getting better. I need to think. Think fast. Chen handed him referral papers. The appointment in Billings is tomorrow at 9. They're expecting you. Whatever else is happening with the ranch, with Hartwell, with your family drama, your health comes first. But it didn't, and Ethan knew it even as he nodded agreement. Health was important when you had time, when you could afford to think in years rather than days. Right now, he had a television crew arriving tomorrow, a corporation trying to steal sacred land, and a promise made 70 years ago that was his to keep or break. Cancer could wait, the dead couldn't. He drove back to the ranch as evening descended, the sky performing its nightly spectacle of color and light, beauty that continued regardless of human suffering or joy. His phone rang continuously, Eleanor checking in, Marcus offering nervous updates, Joseph confirming tribal security deployment. Ethan answered none of them. He needed silence, needed space to process the dual revelations that his body was betraying him the same way Williams had. That the year he'd committed to staying might be all the time he had left for anything. Victoria's rental car sat in the driveway when he arrived. She stood on the porch looking uncertain, an expression that probably felt foreign on her face. I brought documents. Victoria held up a leather briefcase. Everything I could access before they locked me out of the system. Emails, financial records, meeting minutes. 70 years of corporate conspiracy documented by the conspirators themselves. Ethan climbed the porch steps slowly, each one requiring more effort than it should. Come inside. They spread the documents across Williams' decades, building a timeline of harassment, intimidation, and carefully planned destruction. Victoria narrated with the detachment of someone surgically removing parts of her own identity, explaining how Hartwell Mining had systematically acquired surrounding properties, buried environmental reports, bribed county officials. Here, Victoria pulled out an email chain from 15 years ago, shortly after she'd become CEO. This is my father, my adoptive father, Douglas Hartwell, explaining the Carter problem to me. He wrote that the ranch was the keystone, that everything the company had built for 70 years depended on acquiring it. Did he know, Ethan asked, about you being Thomas's daughter? Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she held the email. I don't know. Part of me thinks he must have, that he adopted me specifically to control Thomas's bloodline claim. But another part remembers bedtime stories and birthday parties and the way he looked at me like I mattered. People are complicated. Yes, Ethan thought about William, about the coldness that was really fear, about the distance that was meant as protection. They are. Victoria looked at him closely. Something's wrong. You look worse than this morning. Just tired. Ethan, she used his name like they were family, which technically they were. What happened? The truth came easier than lying. Cancer, probably advanced. I find out for sure tomorrow. Victoria sat back, the documents forgotten. Jesus. Like William. Ethan confirmed. Genetic predisposition, apparently. One more gift from the Carter bloodline. What will you do? Ethan gestured at the documents, the evidence they'd compiled, the fight they were preparing. This. What else is there? You could get treatment. Focus on survival. To what end? Ethan's question genuine. I'm 58, widowed, childless. The ranch will go to the tribe after I'm gone, regardless of whether I die in 2 years or 5. What's the argument for prolonging the inevitable? The argument is that life matters. Victoria's intensity is surprising. I've spent 73 years serving a false legacy, building something that should have never been built. You have a chance to serve a true one. That's worth fighting for. Is it? They were interrupted by headlights, multiple vehicles approaching fast. Ethan moved to the window, saw 6 trucks, tribal security and federal vehicles intermixed. Joseph emerged from the lead truck, his face grim. They're making a move, Joseph called out. Hartwell's contractors are at the cave entrance with excavation equipment. Federal marshals are en route, but still an hour out. We need to hold them until backup arrives. Ethan grabbed William's hunting rifle from the gun cabinet, checked the load with hands that remembered military training, even if his body had aged past peak performance. Victoria followed him outside. You can't go. She grabbed his arm. You're sick. Let Joseph's people handle it. This is my fight. Ethan pulled free gently. Has been since William died, since Thomas made his promise, since Morningstar was buried there. I'm not watching from the sidelines while others defend what I inherited. Then I'm coming too. Victoria, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Her voice final. Those are my father's bones. They're threatening to desecrate. I spent 60 years not knowing him. I won't dishonor his memory now. The convoy moved through darkness, headlights cutting paths through forest that had witnessed generations of conflict, Osami, between those who saw land as sacred and those who saw it as resource. They reached the eastern boundary to find the scene Joseph had described. 4 industrial excavators positioned at the cave entrance, portable lights turning night to day, contractors in hard hats directing equipment. And overseeing it all, a man Ethan recognized from Victoria's documents. Richard Hartwell, Douglas's younger brother, current board chairman, the man who'd orchestrated Victoria's removal and was now personally supervising the desecration of his adopted niece's biological father's sacred site. The convoy stopped 50 yards from the excavators. Joseph's tribal security formed a line between the contractors and the cave entrance, a human barrier backed by federal indigenous rights, but lacking the immediate force to stop machinery designed to move mountains. Richard Hartwell walked forward, flanked by private security, his confidence built on decades of getting his way through money and political connections. He stopped at the line, addressed Joseph like a foreman talking to labor. "You're trespassing on property in active acquisition negotiation. Move or be moved. This is federal protected land under tribal jurisdiction." Joseph's voice carried authority that had nothing to do with age or physical presence. "Those excavators back up now, or you're committing federal crimes." Richard's smile was corporate predator, all teeth and no warmth. "I have county permits. I have environmental clearances. I have every legal authorization needed." "You have forgeries and bribes." Victoria stepped forward, and Richard's smile faltered seeing her. "I know because I used to sign them. Those permits are worthless, Richard. The federal designation supersedes county authority." "Victoria," Richard's tone shifting to disappointed uncle, "this is unfortunate. We hoped you'd see reason after your removal. The board is prepared to bring you back once you've had time to reconsider your position. My position is that you're about to desecrate sacred burial grounds to extract copper that legally cannot be mined." Victoria pulled out her phone. "And I'm documenting everything for the federal investigation that starts tomorrow." Richard's expression hardened. "There won't be an investigation. The county attorney has already declined to pursue charges. The state attorney general has bigger concerns. And federal attention requires federal interest, which we've made sure doesn't exist." "You've made a mistake," Ethan said, stepping forward beside Victoria. "You thought you could bury this the way you've buried everything else for 70 years. But 60 Minutes has a camera crew arriving at dawn. Federal marshals are en route, and every action you take now is being witnessed and recorded." Richard glanced at the tribal security, at the phones documenting everything, calculating odds. Then he gestured to his contractors. "Proceed." The excavators roared to life, massive machines that could tear through rock and earth with indifferent efficiency. They moved toward the cave entrance, where Joseph's security still stood their ground, 20 men and women facing tons of steel with nothing but conviction and federal law. Ethan raised the rifle, not aiming at people but at the lead excavator, firing twice into the hydraulic lines. Oil sprayed, the machine shuddered and died, operator scrambling out, cursing. "That's destruction of property." Richard's shout barely audible over the remaining excavators. "You'll be arrested." Added to the list, Ethan worked the bolt, chambered another round. "How many charges are you up to, Richard?" "Bribery, environmental violations, desecration of federal protected sites, conspiracy to commit fraud." The standoff held, both sides committed, neither backing down. Then new headlights appeared, vehicles moving fast from multiple directions, federal marshals in marked SUVs, and behind them, to Ethan's shock, news vans, cameras already rolling. Annie Brooks emerged from the lead van, Eleanor's granddaughter, the journalist Ethan had barely known, but who apparently took indigenous rights seriously enough to drive through the night. She moved directly to the excavators, camera operator following, broadcasting live to social media platforms and news feeds. "This is Annie Brooks reporting from Montana, where Hartwell Mining Corporation is attempting to desecrate federally protected Cheyenne burial grounds for copper extraction. Behind me, tribal security and family members are making a stand against corporate greed that has threatened this sacred land for 70 years. The federal marshals approached Richard, showing badges and warrants, their authority superseding county permits and corporate lawyers. "Richard Hartwell, you're being detained for investigation of federal crimes, including desecration of protected indigenous sites, violation of the Defense Production Act, strategic reserve designations, and conspiracy to commit environmental fraud." Richard's face went from confident to furious to resigned in the space of seconds. He was wealthy enough, connected enough to believe he'd eventually walk free. But the optics were devastating. Cameras capturing his arrest while contractors scattered and excavators sat silent, and Joseph's people stood their ground with the quiet dignity of those who'd been proven right. Victoria watched her uncle being led away in handcuffs, and Ethan saw on her face not triumph but something more complicated. Grief maybe, for the loss of certainty, for the family she thought she belonged to revealing itself as something darker than she'd known. The federal marshals secured the site, established a perimeter, took statements from everyone present. Annie interviewed Joseph, Victoria, Eleanor, who'd arrived with the journalist. each piece adding to a story that was already going viral, social media amplifying what would have been buried just years earlier. As dawn approached, painting the Montana sky in shades of copper and gold, Ethan sat on a rock outcropping overlooking the burial caves, rifle across his lap, exhausted beyond anything he'd felt in combat zones or hospital rooms. Joseph joined him, settling onto the rock with the ease of someone comfortable in his own skin. "You did well," Joseph said simply. "We'll see." Ethan gestured toward the federal marshals, the news crews. This could go either way. Hartwell has resources, connections. This might just be expensive theater. It's more than that. Joseph's certainty absolute. You made them visible. That's how you win these fights. Not by being stronger, but by making sure the world is watching when they try to crush you. Thomas would be proud. Thomas would be relieved. Joseph corrected. He carried that promise like a weight his whole life. Knowing it's being honored, that Morningstar and his son rest protected, that matters. They sat in comfortable silence, watching light spread across land that had witnessed so much struggle, so much dying, so much stubborn refusal to surrender what mattered. Ethan's phone buzzed. Dr. Chen reminding him about the 9 a.m. appointment in Billings. "You need to go," Joseph said, seeing the message. "Whatever else is happening, your health matters." "Does it?" Ethan's question genuine. What's the point of extending life if life becomes nothing but treatments and hospitals in slow decline? Joseph considered this, then pointed toward the cave entrance where tribal security still maintained watch. Those ancestors sleeping there, they didn't get to choose how long they lived. Morningstar died at 20, her son before he drew breath. What mattered wasn't duration but how they lived, what they stood for, what they left behind. "Is that enough? It's all any of us get." Joseph stood, offered his hand. "Go to your appointment. Get the full diagnosis. Then decide. But decide based on wanting to live, not on fear of dying." Ethan took the offered hand, let Joseph pull him to his feet. His body protested, cancer or age or exhaustion, making every movement difficult. But he stood, and standing felt like choice, like the first step toward whatever came next. The drive to Billings took 2 hours through landscape that seemed to expand rather than contract, Montana opening itself to sky and possibility. Ethan arrived at the hospital with minutes to spare, submitted to tests and scans and the routine humiliation of medical examination. The oncologist was younger than Ethan, maybe 40, with the careful optimism of someone who'd learned to balance hope against reality. Stage 3, locally advanced. The doctor showed him scans that might have been abstract art except they represented Ethan's failing body. PSA levels indicate significant progression, but imaging shows no metastasis to other organs yet. That's the good news. And the bad? Treatment will be aggressive. Hormone therapy, radiation, possibly surgery. Side effects are significant. Quality of life diminishes. And there's no guarantee. 5-year survival rates for stage 3 are around 60%. 60% chance of 5 more years. Ethan tried to find meaning in the numbers. What if I don't treat? Then you're looking at 2 years, maybe less. Increasing pain, increasing disability, eventual organ failure. Not recommended. But faster. The doctor leaned back, studying him. "Mr. Carter, are we talking about treatment options or end-of-life planning?" Ethan thought about William choosing his own end rather than surrender to morphine fog. Thought about Thomas spending 40 years in a prison camp, survival becoming its own form of defeat. Thought about Morningstar, dying at 20 but living fully until she couldn't. "I'm talking about what's worth fighting for," Ethan said finally, "and I honestly don't know the answer." The doctor's expression softened. "That's the hardest question. Medicine can extend life, but it can't tell you what makes life worth extending. That's something only you can answer." Ethan left the hospital with prescriptions he might not fill, referrals he might not keep, and a prognosis that felt less like medical fact than philosophical problem. He had 5 years if he fought, 2 if he didn't, and no clear sense of which choice honored the life he'd lived and the promises he'd inherited. The drive back to the ranch took him through town where news of the standoff had already spread, where people recognized him and waved or stared depending on their position regarding Hartwell mining and corporate development, and the eternal question of whether principle was worth the cost. Marcus met him at the ranch, looking older but more solid somehow, like he'd found footing after years of drift. Victoria called. Marcus reported, "Federal grand jury is convening tomorrow. They want our testimony about Hartwell's harassment campaign. Sounds like they're building a serious case." "Good." Marcus studied him. You look worse than yesterday. What did the doctor say? Ethan told him. The diagnosis and prognosis delivered without emotion, because emotion made it too real. Marcus listened in silence, and when Ethan finished, his cousin's eyes were wet. Damn it, Marcus's voice rough. You finally come back. We finally start to figure out this family mess, and cancer's gonna take you like it took William. Maybe. What are you going to do? Ethan looked at the ranch house, the land spreading beyond it, the weight of promises that had already consumed 3 generations. I'm going to testify tomorrow. Going to make sure Hartwell pays for 70 years of crimes. After that, I don't know. You should fight. Marcus's urgency surprising. Get treatment, extend your time, live long enough to see this through. Why? Because you matter. Marcus's honesty raw. I've spent my whole life resenting you, and I just figured out you're the best thing about this family. You came back when you didn't have to. Honored promises that weren't yours. Stood up to corporations and killers. You're the kind of man Thomas was, the kind William tried to be. That's worth preserving. The words landed with weight Ethan hadn't expected, validation from a source that had only offered criticism before. Marcus had been enemy, obstacle, cautionary tale. Now he was family, the complicated blood and choice kind that mattered most. I'll think about it, Ethan promised. Right now I need to prepare testimony. They want details, dates, documentation of everything Hartwell did. I'll help, Marcus offered. I've got files going back years. Every interaction, every threat, every bribe they tried. We'll build a case they can't ignore. They worked through the afternoon into evening. 2 cousins who'd spent decades as strangers building something that looked like kinship. Victoria joined them after her own federal interview, adding internal documents and executive testimony to the growing pile of evidence. By midnight, they had a timeline that spanned 70 years, showing systematic harassment, environmental violations, probable murders, and conspiracy reaching into county government, state politics, possibly federal agencies. It was devastating if prosecutors believed it, worthless if they didn't. Will it be enough? Victoria asked, exhausted and uncertain. Ethan looked at the documents, at the evidence compiled by people who'd spent their lives fighting a corporation that seemed immortal. He thought about Thomas making promises in 1951, about William dying alone to bring Ethan home, about Morningstar buried beneath copper worth millions, about cancer growing in his own body while he tried to honor the dead. It has to be, because there's nothing more to give. The federal courthouse in Billings looked like every government building Ethan had seen in 30 years of military service. Imposing and impersonal, designed to make citizens feel small against the weight of law and bureaucracy. He climbed the steps slowly, each rise a negotiation with a body that was betraying him cell by cell, and entered corridors that smelled like floor polish and institutional coffee. Victoria waited in the witness preparation room, dressed in a gray suit that somehow made her look more vulnerable than her boardroom armor ever had. Marcus sat beside her, nervous energy making his leg bounce until she put a hand on his knee to still it. They'd spent the past week here testifying before the grand jury, building a case that federal prosecutors believed was airtight, but that Ethan knew could collapse under the weight of corporate lawyers and political pressure. How are you feeling? Victoria asked when Ethan entered, and he knew she meant the cancer as much as the testimony ahead. Like a man with nothing left to lose, which made him honest in ways that could be dangerous or liberating. He hadn't decided which. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Chen, who shared no relation to Dr. Raymond Chen, but carried the same careful competence, entered with files that represented 70 years of corporate malfeasance distilled into prosecutable charges. We have enough, she said without preamble, spreading documents across the table. Bribery, environmental fraud, conspiracy to violate federal protected site designations, witness intimidation. The grand jury returned indictments on all counts. Richard Hartwell, 6 board members, 2 county officials, the state environmental director. 16 people total. Will they go to trial? Marcus asked. Most will plea. Sarah's answer pragmatic. We're offering deals to the smaller players in exchange for testimony against the board. Richard Hartwell will fight, but he's looking at 10 to 15 years minimum if convicted. And the company? Victoria's voice steady, but her hands betrayed tension. What happens to Hartwell Mining? Civil asset forfeiture for the criminal proceeds. Sarah explained. Every property acquired through bribery or fraud gets seized. That's about 60% of their holdings. Combined with the legal fees and settlements from environmental lawsuits, the company will likely file for bankruptcy protection. Victoria nodded slowly, watching 60 years of family legacy dissolve into legal consequences. Good. There's one more thing. Sarah pulled out a different file. We found evidence of a murder-for-hire conspiracy related to William Carter's death. Emails between Richard Hartwell and a contractor named Michael Voss discussing, quote, permanent solutions to the succession problem. Ethan felt ice in his chest. William killed himself. We know. Sarah's tone gentle. Dr. Chen testified to that, but Hartwell didn't know. The emails show they were planning to stage an accident if William didn't die soon enough naturally. They just got lucky that he solved their problem himself. So they intended to murder him. Yes, and that elevates the charges significantly. Sarah closed the file. The testimony you've all given has built a case that goes beyond corporate malfeasance into organized criminal conspiracy. This is RICO territory now. The trial preparation continued through the morning, Sarah drilling them on testimony, preparing them for cross-examination, building a narrative that would make sense to jurors who'd never stood on Montana land or understood why some promises mattered more than money. By noon, Ethan's exhaustion was visible enough that Sarah called a break. He found a quiet corner in the courthouse cafeteria, coffee going cold in his hands, staring at nothing while his mind drifted through timelines both personal and historical. A woman approached his table, maybe 45, with kind eyes and uncertain posture. She carried a folder that looked official and concerning. Mr. Carter? Her voice careful, prepared for rejection. Ethan Carter? He nodded, too tired to be suspicious. My name is Rebecca Mendoza. The woman sat without invitation, hands trembling slightly. This is going to sound strange, but I think you were married to my birth mother. Ethan's exhaustion vanished, replaced by sharp attention. What? Rebecca opened the folder, showed him documents. Adoption certificates. Sarah Carter listed as birth mother. A baby girl born 1982, placed for adoption 3 days later. Genetic testing results showing maternal match to Sarah Carter. Your wife died 3 years ago, Rebecca continued. I'd been searching for her for years. By the time I found the right Sarah Carter, she was already gone. But the lawyer handling her estate contacted me last month. Said Sarah had left a letter to be delivered to me only if I could be found. She handed Ethan an envelope sealed, his dead wife's handwriting, addressing it to Rebecca Lynn, my daughter. Ethan's hands shook as he held it. Sarah never told me she had a child. The letter explained she wanted to. Rebecca's eyes wet. Said your father William arranged the adoption, made her promise never to speak of it. He thought it was shameful, thought it would damage her marriage prospects. She went along because she was 19 and scared and didn't know how to fight him. William. Ethan felt anger and grief mixing into something too complex to name. Always secrets, always protection, disguised as control. She wrote that she thought about me every day. Rebecca's voice breaking, every birthday, every milestone. She wanted to find me but was afraid of disrupting my life, afraid I'd hate her for giving me up. Did you? No. Rebecca smiled through tears. I had good parents. They loved me. I just wanted to know where I came from, who I looked like, whether I belonged somewhere. Ethan studied her face, seeing Sarah in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, seeing family he'd never known existed, connections that extended beyond his own isolation. Why are you telling me this? He asked gently. Because Sarah's letter said you'd want to know, said you'd lost everyone and shouldn't have to die alone. Rebecca pulled out more documents. She left me an inheritance, not money but family history, photographs, letters, stories about her life with you. Ethan's throat tightened. We were married 15 years before she got sick. Best years of my life. She wrote about that, how you made her feel safe, how you understood loss because you'd lived through it, how she wished she could have given you children, but it was too late by the time you met. Except she did. Ethan gestured to Rebecca. You. She gave me you. I just didn't know it. They sat in the courthouse cafeteria, stepfather and stepdaughter, meeting for the first time, connected by a dead woman's love and secrets she'd carried to her grave. Rebecca showed him photographs of her own children, 2 teenagers who were technically Ethan's step-grandchildren, family he'd never imagined having. They live in Denver, Rebecca explained. Miguel is 15, wants to be a doctor. Sophia is 12, activists already, fights every injustice she sees. I've told them about their grandmother, about finding you. They want to meet you. Ethan thought about cancer eating his prostate, about treatment that might give him 5 years or abstinence that would give him two. Thought about dying alone in William's ranch house versus dying surrounded by family he'd just discovered. I'd like that, the words coming easier than expected. I'd like to know them. Rebecca reached across the table, took his hand. Sarah's letter said you inherited a ranch. Said it was complicated, involved in some legal battle. Is that why you're here? Ethan laughed, bitter and genuine. It's a long story. I've got time. So he told her. About William's death and the inheritance. About Thomas in the Korean War prison camp. About Victoria and the discovery of blood family fighting each other unknowingly. About the burial caves and Morning Star and promises that span generations. About cancer and choices and the weight of deciding what mattered enough to die for. Rebecca listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she sat back with the expression of someone recalculating everything they'd thought they understood. You're dying to protect a promise made by a man you never met to honor a woman who died 70 years ago. When you put it that way, it sounds insane. No, Rebecca's voice firm. It sounds like exactly what Sarah would have wanted. She always said the best thing about you was that you understood some things mattered more than comfort. Did she? She did. Rebecca pulled out another letter, this one addressed to Ethan in Sarah's handwriting, dated 3 weeks before she died. She asked her lawyer to give this to you after she was gone, but only if you ever seemed to need it. I think now qualifies. Ethan broke the seal with shaking hands, unfolded pages covered in Sarah's familiar script, written when cancer had already weakened her, but before morphine made writing impossible. My love, the letter began, and Ethan's vision blurred immediately. If you're reading this, I'm gone and you're struggling with something. Knowing you, it's probably something noble and impossible that you've convinced yourself is your responsibility alone. I'm writing this to tell you what I couldn't say often enough when I was alive. You don't have to carry everything yourself. You don't have to be strong enough for everyone. You don't have to sacrifice yourself to prove you're worthy of love. You've spent your life running from your father's coldness, trying to be different, trying to be warm and open and available. And you succeeded, at least with me. You gave me 15 years of feeling cherished and safe. That's not nothing, Ethan. That's everything. But I know you. I know you're probably punishing yourself for something, probably convinced that you failed someone, probably determined to make it right through suffering. Stop. You didn't fail your father. You didn't fail me. You didn't fail whatever cause or person or principle is making you read this letter. You've always done your best with imperfect information and impossible circumstances. That's all anyone can do. If you're sick, get treatment. Don't choose noble death over messy survival. I chose survival for as long as I could, and I'm grateful for every extra day, even the hard ones. If you're alone, find family. It doesn't have to be blood. It can be chosen, built from friendship and shared purpose. I wish I told you about Rebecca. William made me promise not to, and I kept that promise even though it was wrong. She's out there somewhere, your stepdaughter, my daughter. Find her if you can. If you're fighting for something, make sure it's worth the cost. Not in abstract terms, but in real days and nights and years you could spend doing something else. Some battles need fighting. Others are just distractions from the harder work of living. Whatever you decide, know this. You were the best thing in my life. You made dying less frightening because I knew you'd grieve well, honor my memory without being destroyed by it, eventually find a way to keep living. Do that, Ethan. Keep living. Not just surviving, but actually living. Find joy where you can. Love people who deserve it. Waste time on beautiful, useless things. Be inefficient and impractical and human. The world has enough martyrs. It needs more men who understand that staying alive, staying present, staying soft in a hard world, that's the real courage. I love you. I'll love you after I'm gone. And wherever you are when you read this, whatever you're facing, I believe in your ability to choose wisely. Your wife, always and forever, Sarah. Ethan read the letter 3 times, each pass finding new weight in familiar phrases. Sarah had known him, had understood his tendencies toward noble self-destruction, had tried to guide him even from beyond death. She's right, Rebecca said quietly, about all of it. I know. So what will you do? Ethan folded the letter carefully, placed it in his jacket next to William's final words. Carrying the dead close to his heart, I'll finish the testimony, see the trial through, then I'll decide. The trial lasted 3 weeks, a parade of witnesses and documents and expert testimony that built a case so overwhelming that even high-priced defense lawyers couldn't find cracks. Ethan testified for 2 days, walking jurors through 70 years of harassment, explaining the sacred burial grounds, describing the morning he'd faced 6 contractors prepared to kill him for defending land they thought should be theirs. Victoria's testimony was devastating, a former CEO providing insider evidence of corporate conspiracy that left the defense scrambling. Marcus corroborated everything, adding details about bribes he'd been offered and threats he'd witnessed. The tribal elders testified about the burial caves, about promises made and kept, about sacred ground that had survived displacement and seizure and 70 years of corporate pressure. Joseph Redfeather the Younger brought photographs of the chamber, of Morningstar's resting place, of copper glowing in flashlight beams like blood in veins. The jury deliberated 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Richard Hartwell received 15 years in federal prison. Board members got sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. County officials who'd taken bribes faced their own state charges. And Hartwell Mining Corporation, stripped of leadership and assets, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation. The victory was complete and hollow at the same time. Justice served, but William still dead, Thomas still lost to history, Morningstar still sleeping beneath ground that would remain sacred because so many people had sacrificed so much to keep it that way. After the verdict, Ethan stood outside the courthouse watching media coverage scroll across his phone. The story had gone national, then international, becoming a symbol of indigenous rights and corporate accountability and the power of individuals standing against institutions. Annie Brooks had won a journalism award for her coverage. Eleanor Brooks had been interviewed by NPR. Joseph Redfeather appeared on PBS talking about sacred site protection. Even Marcus had become something of a folk hero, the reformed insider who testified against his own interests. But Ethan felt only exhaustion, the kind that came not from physical exertion, but from carrying weight too long. He'd done what William asked, honored Thomas's promise, protected the burial caves, brought Hartwell to justice. Now what? Rebecca found him sitting on a courthouse bench, watching people stream past with their own problems and purposes, lives that continued regardless of his small victory in Montana. "The kids want to meet you," she said without preamble. "I told them about the ranch, about their grandmother, about you. They want to come visit before school starts." Ethan looked at her, seeing Sarah in the gesture, in the determined kindness that insisted on connection even when distance seemed easier. "When? This weekend if you're up for it," Rebecca's tone carefully neutral. "But Ethan, you need to decide about treatment. Dr. Chen called me. Said you've been avoiding his calls. Said the cancer is progressing." "I know. Then you know you're running out of time to start therapy. Every week you wait decreases effectiveness." Ethan stood, joints protesting, body offering evidence of its own decline. "Let's go back to the ranch. I'll think better there." The drive from Billings to the ranch took 2 hours through landscape that had become familiar. Montana revealing itself in layers of meaning Ethan hadn't seen when he'd first arrived for William's funeral. Then it had been just land, acreage, property with value measured in dollars and agricultural yield. Now it was cemetery and cathedral both, holding the dead and honoring the promises that outlived them. Victoria's rental car sat in the driveway, and she emerged as Ethan parked, looking more at peace than he'd seen her since learning about Thomas. "I wanted to talk before I head back to California." Victoria gestured toward the porch. "Do you have a few minutes?" They sat in William's old chairs, wood-worn smooth by generations of Carters, watching the same sunset paint, the same sky in endlessly varied colors. Victoria held an envelope, legal-sized, official. The bankruptcy trustee finalized Hartwell Mining's liquidation. She said without preamble, all assets are being sold to pay creditors and victims of environmental damage. "The company I spent my life building is being dismantled piece by piece." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Victoria's smile sad but genuine. "It deserved to die. Everything it was built on was rotten. My father, my adoptive father, he tried to build something that mattered, but compromised so much along the way that the foundation crumbled." "What will you do?" "Start over." Victoria handed him the envelope. "But first I wanted to give you this. I can't undo the harm Hartwell caused your family. Can't bring back the years William spent fighting alone. Can't restore Thomas's lost decades. But I can return what was stolen." Inside the envelope, Ethan found property deeds. 15 parcels surrounding the ranch, all the land Hartwell had acquired over 70 years, all of it being transferred to the Northern Cheyenne Tribal Trust. "The bankruptcy court approved it," Victoria explained. As part of the settlement, I propose returning all land acquired through fraudulent means to its original indigenous owners. The tribal council accepted. Starting next month, 3,000 acres surrounding your ranch becomes tribal land again. Ethan stared at the deeds, understanding the magnitude of what Victoria had orchestrated. This is billions in potential development value. This is justice, Victoria corrected, and maybe the beginning of healing. I can't change who I was, but I can choose who I become. I choose to honor Thomas, even though I never knew him. Choose to honor Morning Star in their lost child. Choose to be a Carter, if you'll have me. Your family, Ethan's voice rough with emotion. Blood and choice both. You're always welcome here. After Victoria left, Ethan spent the evening in William's study, surrounded by journals and letters, and the accumulated evidence of 3 generations fighting the same fight. He thought about Sarah's letter, about her plea that he choose living over noble death, thought about Rebecca's children who wanted to meet their step-grandfather before cancer took him. Thought about Joseph's observation that what mattered wasn't duration, but how you spent whatever time you had. His phone rang. Dr. Chen, persistent and patient. I'm starting treatment, Ethan said before the doctor could speak. Tomorrow, whatever you recommend. Chen's relief was audible. Thank you. Come in at 9. We'll start hormone therapy immediately. Schedule radiation. Discuss surgical options. You're making the right choice. Am I? Sarah thought so, Chen said gently. She told me once toward the end that you had a tendency to punish yourself. Said someone needed to remind you that living wasn't selfish. Ethan hung up and sat in the gathering darkness, feeling the decision settle over him like weight or like wings, he couldn't tell which. 2 to 5 more years of existence, much of it probably spent in hospitals and pain management and the slow erosion of everything that made him himself. But also 2 to 5 more years of sunsets over Montana, of teaching Rebecca's children to ride horses, of watching the burial caves remain protected, of knowing he'd chosen the harder path not because it was noble, but because it meant more time to matter, more days to get it right. The weekend brought Rebecca and her children, Miguel and Sophia, emerging from the rental car with the wide-eyed wonder of city kids seeing ranch land for the first time. Ethan watched them explore, seeing Sarah in their gestures, seeing future in their questions. Miguel was serious and curious, asking detailed questions about ranch management and copper deposits and whether cancer treatments really worked. Sophia was fierce and idealistic, immediately demanding to see the burial caves, wanting to understand what her step-grandfather had fought to protect. Ethan arranged it with Joseph, and the 3 of them, step-grandfather and step-grandchildren, descended into the earth to stand in the chamber where Morning Star slept. Sophia cried when she saw the burial platforms, understanding without needing explanation why some things mattered more than money. Miguel stood quiet, processing, and later asked Ethan if dying for principle was brave or stupid. Sometimes both. Ethan answered honestly. The trick is making sure it's worth it either way. They spent the week learning the ranch, fixing fences, riding horses, talking late into the night about life and death and the weight of family legacy. Rebecca watched with careful joy, seeing her children connect to history she'd never known existed, seeing Ethan transform from isolated widower to patriarch of a family accidentally assembled. On their final evening, they gathered on the porch for sunset, 5 people bound by blood once removed and choice deliberately made. Joseph Redfeather arrived with tribal elders, carrying documents that required ceremony to transfer. Ethan Carter. Joseph's formal tone signaled significance. The Northern Cheyenne Tribal Council has voted unanimously to accept the Carter Ranch into permanent tribal trust, with conditions that honor the promises made by Thomas Carter and kept by William Carter. The terms were generous and clear. The land would be protected forever, mining forbidden, sacred sites maintained. But Ethan would retain life estate, living on the property until his death. Rebecca and her children would have access rights in perpetuity, honored as family of the man who'd kept faith with the dead. After his death, the land would pass fully to tribal management, becoming part of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, protected under federal indigenous rights that superseded state jurisdiction and corporate ambition. It's more than we deserve, Ethan said quietly. It's exactly what was promised, Joseph corrected. Thomas said the land would be protected. You ensured it. This is us honoring that promise, same as your family honored ours. The signing happened at sunset, witnessed by family and friends and the ghosts that seemed to gather in the fading light. Ethan signed with hands that trembled from emotion or cancer treatment. He couldn't tell which and didn't care. The land was safe, the promise kept, the burden passed to others who would carry it forward. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan walked to the burial caves alone. Joseph's security had standing permission to let him pass, and he descended into the earth with only a flashlight and the accumulated weight of everything he'd learned since William's funeral. He stood before Morningstar's burial platform, before the small bundle that had been Thomas's first child, and spoke aloud words he'd been forming for months. I never met you, either of you, but I've been living in your shadow, trying to honor promises you made before I was born. I hope I did it right. Hope Thomas would be proud. Hope William can finally rest knowing the land is safe. The cave offered no response except the eternal silence of the dead, but Ethan felt something shift anyway, like setting down weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was burden. I'm going to live, he told the darkness. Going to fight the cancer, spend time with Rebecca's kids, try to figure out what the rest of my life looks like. I don't know if that's what you'd want, but it's what Sarah wanted, and I trust her judgment more than I trust my own. He climbed back to the surface as dawn approached, emerging into light that felt different somehow, cleaner, full of possibility rather than obligation. The years that followed were harder than Ethan expected and better than he'd hoped. Hormone therapy made him tired and emotional. Radiation burned and weakened. Surgery removed his prostate and his illusions about masculine invulnerability. But he survived, one treatment at a time, one day after another, learning that living with cancer was less about fighting and more about accepting the body's limitations, while refusing to let those limitations define everything. Rebecca's family visited every summer, the kids growing taller and more independent, Miguel heading to college for pre-med, Sophia becoming an environmental activist whose passion reminded Ethan of Morningstar's fierce protection of sacred ground. He taught them what he could about the land, about promises, about choosing principle over comfort. Victoria came quarterly, rebuilding relationship with the cousin she'd never known, the sister by blood if not by upbringing. She'd started a consulting firm helping companies transition away from extractive industries toward sustainable practices, using her insider knowledge to dismantle the systems she'd once served. Marcus stayed in Montana, working as a ranch manager for tribal lands, finding purpose in preserving what he'd once been willing to destroy. They never became close friends, but they achieved something like brotherhood, the complicated kind built on shared failure and mutual redemption. Annie Brooks married Joseph Redfeather the Younger, combining journalism and tribal activism in ways that made both more effective. Eleanor served as librarian until 90, preserving history and making sure young people understood the price their ancestors had paid for the land they inherited. 4 years after the trial, Ethan's cancer returned. Stage 4 this time, metastasized terminal. Dr. Chen delivered the news with the gentle certainty of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation since the initial diagnosis. How long, Ethan asked, calm because he'd already lived 4 years longer than seemed possible when he'd first been diagnosed. Months. Maybe 6 with treatment. Chen's honesty unflinching. Or we can focus on palliative care, keeping you comfortable, rather than trying for cure we both know isn't coming. Comfort. Ethan decided without hesitation. I've fought long enough. He called Rebecca from the hospital, told her to bring the kids one final time, called Victoria and Marcus and Joseph, gathering the family he'd assembled from blood and choice and shared purpose. They came quickly, understanding time was measured in weeks now rather than years. The ranch house filled with people and noise and life, exactly the opposite of how William had died, isolated and bitter and alone. Ethan held court from the couch he was too weak to leave, telling stories about Thomas and William, about Morningstar and Sarah, about the long chain of connection that bound them all. Miguel, 19 now and serious, asked the question that had haunted him since childhood. Was it worth it? All the fighting, all the suffering. Did it matter? Ethan considered carefully, wanting to give truth rather than comfort. I don't know. In the grand scheme of eternal time, probably not. The universe doesn't care about Montana or copper or promises made by dead men. But it mattered to us, to Thomas and Morningstar, to William carrying weight he shouldn't have carried alone, to me finding purpose when I thought I'd lost everything, to you learning that some things are worth protecting even when protection costs everything. Does that make it worth it? Sophia asked, 16 and fierce. You'll have to decide that for yourself. Ethan smiled at her. That's the gift and burden of being alive. You get to choose what matters, then live or die by that choice. On his final night, Ethan asked Joseph to arrange one last visit to the burial caves. They carried him on a litter, tribal security and family together, descending into earth that would soon claim him too. They placed him before Morningstar's platform, and Ethan reached out with shaking hands to touch the wood that held her bones. I kept the promise, he whispered. Thomas would be proud. Joseph stood beside him, hand on his shoulder. We all are. The trip back to the surface exhausted Ethan completely, and he slipped into morphine fog that made the distinction between waking and sleeping, living and dying, less clear with each passing hour. He died 3 days later, 58 plus 4 more years he'd stolen from cancer through stubbornness and treatment and the desire to know Rebecca's children before they forgot him. He died surrounded by family, holding Victoria's hand on one side and Rebecca's on the other, while Miguel and Sophia sat at his feet and Marcus stood in the doorway looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. His final words were to Rebecca. Tell them I tried to get it right. You did, she promised through tears. You did. The funeral was held at the burial caves. Northern Cheyenne ceremony, mixed with military honors, mixed with the kind of improvised grief that happens when people lose someone they'd only recently learned to love. They buried him in the chamber with Morning Star and Thomas's first child, adding another Carter to the sacred ground 3 generations had died protecting. The headstone was simple granite, inscribed with words Victoria had chosen. Ethan Carter, 1967 to 2029. Keeper of promises, uncle to all who followed. 10 years after Ethan's death, Miguel Carter Mendoza returned to the ranch as a doctor, establishing a free clinic on tribal land, serving indigenous communities that had been medically underserved for generations. He married a Cheyenne woman, had children who were Carter and Red Feather both, binding the families together in ways that would have seemed impossible when Ethan first arrived for William's funeral. Sophia became an environmental lawyer, fighting mining companies across the West, using the burial caves as precedent for indigenous rights cases, winning more often than she lost. She never married, devoted her life to the cause Thomas had died for and Ethan had lived to protect. Rebecca spent her later years compiling family history, working with Eleanor and Annie to create an archive that documented 4 generations of Carters fighting for land that was never really theirs to own, only to protect. Victoria lived to 94, long enough to see Hartwell mining become a case study in corporate reform textbooks, a cautionary tale about profit over principle. She died in Montana, visiting the burial caves one final time, and was buried beside Douglas Hartwell in California, honoring both fathers, choosing both identities. The ranch remained in tribal trust, protected by federal designation and by the accumulated weight of people who'd refused to let it be destroyed. The copper stayed in the ground, worth billions that would never be extracted, a sacrifice that seemed increasingly reasonable as climate change made clear that not all resources should be consumed simply because they could be. And the burial caves held their dead, Morning Star and Thomas's child and Ethan, and eventually others. Family expanded to include anyone who'd honored the promise, who'd stood in the gap between what was and what should be, who'd chosen principle over profit and paid whatever price that choice demanded. Some legacies were measured in money, others in land preserved, still others in promises kept across generations, in children taught to value more than profit, in the stubborn insistence that some things mattered more than survival, that honor and sacrifice and standing for principle weren't foolish but fundamental to being human. The copper remained beneath Montana soil, glowing in the darkness, waiting for a future that might need it more than the present needed profit. And above it, the living continued their work, learning from the dead, teaching the young, keeping faith with promises made by people they'd never met, but whose legacy they carried in blood and bone, and the determined refusal to let memory fade into convenience. That was Ethan Carter's inheritance. Not land or money, but the knowledge that one person standing firm could matter. That principle could outlast profit. That promises made in love were worth keeping, even when keeping them cost everything. In the end, that was enough for Thomas and Morning Star, for William and Sarah, for Ethan and Rebecca, for all the children who would come after, learning that some graves were too sacred to disturb, that some promises were too important to break, that some lives were worth living, not because they were easy, but because they stood for something that would outlast the bodies that briefly carried them. The Montana sky stretched eternal over land that had witnessed so much struggle, so much dying, so much stubborn refusal to surrender what mattered. And beneath that sky, the living and the dead rested together, bound by promises that transcended time and flesh and the temporary nature of everything except what we choose to make permanent through the sheer force of believing it matters. They had believed, Thomas and William and Ethan, Victoria and Marcus and Rebecca, all of them choosing to stand for something larger than themselves, to honor the dead by living well, to pass to the next generation not just land, but the understanding that some things were worth protecting regardless of cost. That was the Copper Testament, not wealth but wisdom, not profit but principle, not survival but the kind of living that made survival mean something more than just breathing until you stopped. And in the burial caves beneath Montana soil, the ancestors slept on, protected by the promises of the living, honored by the sacrifices of those who'd chosen the hard path over the easy one, knowing that every generation would face the same choice between what was profitable and what was right, and hoping that enough would choose rightly to make the struggle worthwhile. The struggle had been worth it, for Thomas, for William, for Ethan, for all who came after. Some questions answered themselves by the living of them. And this one, written in copper and bone and the accumulated choices of people who refused to be bought, had answered itself across 4 generations with a single word that echoed through time like a promise kept, like a vow honored, like the fundamental truth that made all the sacrifice worthwhile. Yes, it had been worth it. All of it. Every hard choice and painful loss and moment of doubt. Every treatment endured and relationship rebuilt and promise honored. Every stand taken when backing down would have been easier. Worth it. And the land, the sacred land purchased with blood and grief and stubborn refusal to surrender, would remain protected, bearing witness to that truth for as long as mountains stood and rivers ran, and people remembered that some things mattered more than profit, more than comfort, more than life itself. The Copper Testament, written in sacrifice and sealed with honor, would endure.